World is looking at India with anticipation, with hope in a challenging time, and with several questions. How has India shaped the G20? And how has the G20 presidency shaped India's global future? Those are questions that are buzzing not just here in India, but across the world as the global economies look towards India for the G20 summit. Now, the meeting that India will host is not just pivotal for our own global future, but it defines and structures the decisions and the strategies that the world's top economies will take in the near future. And the numbers really tell us about the power of the G20 meeting. The meeting that India will host just next week will have 20 countries that represent about 85% of the global GDP, over 75% of global trade, and about 2/3 of the world's population. The top leaders of these powerful countries will all come together here in the national capital next week to discuss the challenges facing the global economy today. While the annual G20 summit, of course, has rotating presidency, India's G20 presidency has been an outlier for many reasons. First, and you might be surprised to know this, the in-person participation during India's G20 presidency has been among the largest ever. Over 150 meetings have been held in over 40 cities across 28 states and union territories over the last 9 months. India has proudly hosted over 12,000 delegates from more than 110 nationalities, from G20 countries, 9 invitee countries, and 14 international organizations. Along with one of the largest in-person participation, India's G20 presidency stands out for another very important reason. It comes at a time when the global economy is facing several challenges: geopolitical tensions, skyrocketing inflation, cost of living crisis in several countries, supply disruptions, and countless economic challenges after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Over the next few hours, we'll have insightful conversations, thought-provoking discussions, and important addresses by the top voices behind India's G20 presidency. It's my pleasure to introduce the first guest for the day, who's best positioned to speak about India's aim to become a global business hub. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Piyush Goyal, the Honorable Minister for Commerce, Industry, Consumer Affairs, Food and Public Distribution. May I invite Sir and NDTV's Editorial Director, Sonia Singh, to please come on stage for a conversation.
Good morning, and what a wonderful way to launch NDTV's Decoding G20 Conclave with the man who's been working silently behind the scenes and very much at the forefront of pushing various, besides G20, but also trade agreements, is the Honorable Minister for Commerce, Piyush Goyal, who's just come back from Jaipur after a very successful trade ministers meet. Thank you so much for joining us today on the conclave, Mr. Goyal. But of course, first, what a wonderful week it's been for India. And I think Chandrayaan-3 and India being on the moon, and the fact that the world's most powerful leaders are going to be in India next week, has really all come together to showcase where India is in the world today.
Thank you, Sonia, and a very good morning to all the viewers of NDTV. It's indeed a matter of great pride that our scientists have finally taken us to the moon and taken us in grand style. We are the first country in the world to ever land on the solar south surface, on the moon's south surface. And in a manner of speaking, that's reflective of the new India, the emerging confident India that we are seeing on the world stage. As you rightly pointed out, this has been a week of many celebrations. The Prime Minister, in fact, landed directly at Bengaluru from Greece to compliment and be with all the scientists. And I think when you look at the G20 in the context of India's emerging strength on the global stage, the Chandrayaan-3 landing was a very appropriate beginning to the next fortnight of engagements, celebrities, and India's own presence at the world stage. We just had the G20 Trade and Investment Ministers meeting in Jaipur, and it started just the day after the landing. And I promise you, the entire world's leaders from the trade and industry side were completely in awe of the India story. They're looking at India as leading global growth. They're looking at India to provide leadership to the world economy. They're looking at India bringing sanity to the progress of mankind. They're looking at India to bring inclusivity as we proceed towards greater good of mankind. And therefore, the India G20 presidency and its theme of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world is one family, very appropriately fits into the broken world's desire to get back into harmony. The one earth, one family, one future is going to be the defining theme that the world is going to converge on. And I have no doubt in my mind that Prime Minister Modi will provide leadership to the global effort to bring peace and harmony to the world.
It's interesting because, Mr. Goel, if we just look back at this 1 year, when it first came that India was getting the G20 presidency, there were those who said, well, you know, this happens and it's a routine thing. But India in this 1 year has really redefined what the G20 presidency means. We've just heard Mr. Amitabh Kant say, in a sense, the G20 under India's presidency is now more powerful than the UN Security Council. Is this a sign of India not accepting the current global way that multilateral organizations are run, that there has to be reform and India has to be the center stage of that reform when we look at global organizations?
Well, very clearly, Prime Minister Modi, ever since 2014-15, when India played a very important role at the Paris summit, at COP21, and helped bring the world together to agree on the Paris declarations, has, over the last several years, taken a leadership role bringing together the global south, the less developed countries, the developing and emerging economies, and provided voice to their aspirations and their future. We saw that on several forums. We saw that at the WTO MC12 held in Geneva last year, where an almost collapsed WTO ministerial was retrieved thanks to the guidance given by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the leadership that we were able to demonstrate. And all of this centers around trust. What Prime Minister Modi has done is earned the trust for India from the rest of the world. And that trust is certainly the defining factor of our G20 presidency. As was just mentioned, the G20 grouping represents nearly 85% of the world's GDP. In fact, only yesterday at the B20 summit, which is also very, very widely represented by 55 countries who have participated in our B20, probably the largest business engagement that India has seen in so many years. We had 15 trade ministers on one stage, representing, I think, nearly 80 to 85 trillion dollars of global economy. And that is the power, that is the strength that India has offered to the world. The fact that we can bring diverse opinions on one stage, we can collectively agree on almost every issue related to trade and industry, amongst other things. And the fact that despite all the challenges that the world is facing, India has been able to save and accept the geopolitical issue, bring convergence in all our tracks, convergence on issues, bring a new dimension to the future, and offer to the world a stage, a platform, which will help redefine the boundaries of world growth, redefine the potential of international trade. And in that sense, the leadership role that India has achieved is true testimony to the sheer grit and potential of 140 crore Indians.
No, because it has been an extremely tough negotiation as well. We see all the events, but we're not looking at all the backroom hard negotiations happening. Even the trade ministers meet, the successful one you talked about, didn't have a communique because of disagreement on a paragraph on Ukraine. We've heard what the US ambassador has said about Ukraine. Do you expect that in the communique for the G20 heads of state summit that this is going to be an insurmountable problem?
Well, nothing in life is insurmountable. I think we are all optimists. And today, this young India with such a exceptionally attractive young demographic profile, under 30, which over the next 30 years is going to continue to remain under 30 and possibly add to global economy as a contribution from India, $30 trillion. We are looking at growing from 3.5 trillion to 35 trillion in the next 25 years. I think this resurgent India today offers a beacon of hope that nothing is impossible. We are going to persevere, and we are still very confident that we'll be able to bring convergence. You must note that almost all the tracks came out with an outcome document and chair's text. It was not just a chair's text. There were significant outcomes, including in our meeting yesterday, where we came up with a Jaipur call for action, which will support the MSMEs in a big way in India. We came out with significant agreement amongst all countries, all member and invitee countries, that we will look at digitization in this interconnected world so that global trade can be paperless. And we were also able to look at convergence on mapping global value chains to make them more resilient. Now, such significant tasks for the future reflect very well on our ability to steer different viewpoints, different thoughts on the table. And while, of course, there is the geopolitical issue on which convergence at our ministerial level was not possible, I'm sure given Mr. Modi's astute leadership and his popularity, the command that he has amongst world leaders, the friendships that he has forged with world leaders, we will see some good outcomes coming out of the Leaders Summit early next month. I'm very confident it's going to be a one-in-a-kind G20 summit, just as over the year, not in 40 cities, but actually over 55 cities, representing every state in the country, every union territory of the country. We had close to 200 meetings between the working groups and the ministerials and engagement groups. We had over 100,000 people coming from all over the world to visit India. I would think today every single Indian, be it somebody in the remotest villages of India, recognizes and respects India's pole position in the global order. And therefore, I think it's a matter of great pride that we have taken the G20 to the next level. Very often, programs bring luster to the country. I think India has been able to add luster to the G20 itself.
And in fact, even just coming back to when the Ukraine invasion began, India took a very strong stand on its view that it refused to go with the Western way, it refused to be pinned into a hole on what its statements or what its stance should be. We've seen over the last 1 year, there's been a change in the US especially and the West on how they first wanted almost condemnatory in their statements against India's stand, to now a sense of more acceptance to recognition that it's the India way, as the foreign minister has been saying. Do you think that's been the big change? We've seen the expansion of BRICS as well just last week. Also the fact that President Xi will be here in India as well as of now. President Putin not coming, but how do you think that 1 year has played out geopolitically? Because that really is where India is creating an India way.
Well, India always stands for peace and harmony, and not today, for centuries and I think millenniums. India has been a country which has been a beacon of hope and enlightenment for people across the world. And India has consistently taken the stand that this is not an era of war. Prime Minister Modi, in fact, gave leadership at Bali during the Indonesian presidency and help the world converge, that dialogue and diplomacy will be the way forward. And I think that's truly been India's strength, the fact that he's one sane voice amongst a lot of different viewpoints, who's able to bring convergence in the world thinking that we have to have peace in the world for progress. Our bigger challenges are poverty. Our bigger challenges are meeting the sustainable development goals. Our bigger challenges are to address the needs of a young world, which is not desirous of problems, but is desirous of all the good things of life for their families and for the future.
Of course, but as the G20 talks about greater economic ties across borders globally, we've seen that countries across the world, whether it's the US and now India, imposing protectionist curbs on, say, laptop imports, etc. Also, that you've seen global food prices rising at a record high. What is the impact on India, and what is behind the government's logic of imposing protectionist duties, whether it's on laptop curbs and export duties on onions?
I think it's a matter of perspective, whether it's protectionist duties or they are fair and equitable trade practices. There's also the security element, and clearly the laptop restrictions emerge out of security concerns. Each one of your viewers uses laptops all the time. I see programs on NDTV on technology and articulating the intricacies and all the good that technology can bring in, also at times warning people about the pitfalls of technology. And I think our curbs, as many other countries around the world have brought it, have been more security related. India certainly is not a protectionist country, but India respects that there have to be transparent rules of trade. And wherever we find that countries are not giving a level playing field to Indian businesses, wherever we find that Indian businesses are discriminated due to maybe undeclared or undisclosed subsidies or non-tariff barriers, the India of today is not a weak India. The India of today retaliates. The India of today takes action. The India of today stands with our MSMEs, with our domestic manufacturing or other capabilities. And therefore, when you view this in the lens of reciprocity, you will find that India actually is probably the most transparent in its trading practices, the most fair in its openness, yet an opportunity for growth, finally for India, because today we don't allow anybody to take Indian industry on the wrong end of the stick. We are making sure that Indian business, Indian industry gets a level playing field.
Right, and as we are at the B20, India's future is really going to shape the world's future. Thank you so much, Mr. Piyush Goyal, Honorable Minister, for decoding the Modi government's vision of G20. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonia. Bye-bye.
The world is full of challenges. We in India view these challenges as an opportunity because during G20, our ambition, as the Prime Minister has said, is to be inclusive, to be very decisive, to be ambitious, and to be action-oriented. Our presidency has been very different from any other country because in most countries, the G20 is held in one city or maximum two cities. It's very unlike doing a World Cup in Qatar where you do it for about 21 days or doing a World Cup in cricket, which we do in India for about 15 days. G20 is through the year. And therefore, we use this opportunity to take G20 out into every single state of India, every single state of India. We've covered over 60 cities and used this opportunity to improve infrastructure in all these cities. So when you go to these cities, you will see drainage, sewage, solid waste, all roads, all infrastructure getting improved in all these cities. The second is we took it to the people of India, and every single citizen of India was involved in G20 in some manner or the other. And we, for the first time, foreign policy and diplomacy reached every single household of India. The other key issue has been that this presidency is being hosted at a point of time when India has emerged as the 5th largest economy in the world, and we are likely to be the 3rd largest economy in the world by 2027. Ladies and gentlemen, we've done a lot during the last 7-8 years. We've built about 40 million houses, which is like making a house for every Australian. We've made about 110 million toilets, which is like making a toilet for every single citizen of Germany. We've provided 223 million piped water connections, which is like providing a water connection to every single citizen of Brazil. We've made 55,000 kilometers of road, and during the COVID period, we've provided COVID vaccination almost paperless to 2.2 billion people of India. So the political leadership and the development story of India is quite a phenomenal story of what we've done in the last 7 to 8 years. And as the Bank of International Settlement has said, in the digital transformation story of India, where we do about 46% of the real fast time payments in the world, we do 11x of what USA and Europe do, we do 4x of what China does. It's what we've achieved in 7 years is equivalent to what India normally would have achieved in 50 years' time. But let me come to the priorities which India is putting forth in the G20, and the first and foremost to our mind is that the world must have strong, sustained, balanced and inclusive growth, which is critical for the world. Second is to accelerate the pace of sustainable development goals, because only 12 of the 169 SDGs are on track right now. And you need to accelerate the pace of learning outcomes, health outcomes, nutritional standards, and make it inclusive. And that is critical. And the third key priority is that climate action and climate finance are very critical. The world may survive, but we'll all go extinct if we are not able to live up to 1.5 degrees centigrade. We have not carbonized the world, but irrespective of the fact that we occupy only 1.3% of the carbon space, it is incumbent upon all of us to actually play a very key and a critical role in carbon action, and therefore the Prime Minister's philosophy of lifestyle for sustainable development. And fourthly, for both SDG and climate action, you need long-term finance. And therefore, the multilateral financial institutions which were built post-World War II during the post-Bretton Woods period need to be greatly redesigned and reformulated so that they move away from direct lending to indirect lending and are able to generate resources from the private sector, do blended finance, first loss guarantees, credit enhancement. There's no shortage of funds in the world. There's $350 trillion. The world needs $7 trillion, but $350 trillion are available, $150 trillion with pension funds themselves. But you need multilateral financial institutions to be able to mobilize them for both SDG and climate action. And then our priority is technological transformation and digital public infrastructure, which India has built up, which to our mind, if you look around the world, 4 billion people do not have a digital identity, 3 billion people do not even have a bank account, almost 133 countries do not even have fast payments. So if you want to do inclusive development and focus on SDG, you need technological transformation with digital public infrastructure. And lastly, our priority of the Prime Minister has been that women-led development, that is women empowerment and gender equality, will be very critical, and women have to be put into positions of leadership so that we can enhance their learning outcomes, we can improve their health standards, break this huge vicious cycle of malnutrition. And if women are going to be 50% of the population, they really need to move the world needle, because as the World Economic Survey says, World Economic Forum says that it will take 132 years to bring gender parity. We do not have 132 years. We have just about a decade. And therefore, that is a key priority for India. So ladies and gentlemen, India's G20 presidency has been inclusive, it has been decisive, it has been very action-oriented, and to our mind, we've taken this G20 to the people of India and tried to transform the very structure and make a paradigm shift by focusing on the global south, which to our mind is very critical, because as the IMF says, this year 80% of the growth is going to come from the global south. next 2 decades, 2/3 of the global growth is going to emerge from global south simply because the demographics are in their favor. The population in these countries is young. The population in the western part of the world is aging. And therefore, if growth is going to come to these parts of the world, you need financial flows to take place to the global south. Unfortunately, the international financial structure and the multilateral financial institutions are not designed for that, and that's one of our key priorities. So, ladies and gentlemen, we look forward to the Leaders Summit, which will be the key. The Leaders Summit will have the New Delhi leaders' statement, and we look forward to a very, as the Prime Minister said, a very inclusive, decisive, forward-looking, and an ambitious, action-oriented leader's statement. These negotiations are presently on every day, and every word is hotly contested. Every word is debated between 20 countries. It's a very tough and arduous task, but I can assure you that India will more than deliver on G20. Thank you very much, ladies.
Well, thank you, and it's a privilege to be here. And before I begin, Mr. Khan, I'd like to thank you for the wonderful collaboration that has made this report possible. It's been a fun journey, and I hope this is the start, not the end. So thank you. I also wanted to say how excited I am to be here in India. I've been to India 4 times in the last year, and last year I was on record saying that I really believe this is India's century. And I stand behind that statement. Our 2047 report shows that India will grow by 8% per year between now and 2047. India will add 220 million non-farm jobs to its economy, driving inclusive growth. India will have over 60% female participation rate in the workforce by 2047. And India's per capita income, when all these are realized, will be over $20,000 per person, 10 times what it is today. Why? There's phenomenal tailwinds for India. If you think about the world's talent factory, 20% of the world's talent resides here in the working population age. When we think about supply chains, we've identified over $1 trillion of economic value as supply chains are reimagined in India. And finally, when we think about digitization, there's only over 850 million internet users in India that provide a foundation for a technological future. Maybe most exciting that all 3 of my kids reminded me of was the lunar landing. They all watched it, and as my daughter, who's in university, also pointed out, she said the total cost was less than Interstellar. And that shows something in terms of revolution, right? It's phenomenal. So I can think of no better place to start to talk about the issues that I'm about to tee up than here in India. It's India's moment, and India can lead on this dimension. Before I get into the formal launch of the report, I would also like to just perhaps share some contextual framework in terms of what's going on in the world around us. I would argue as we look at this decade and we embark on solving these challenges, there have been no time in history when the confluence of forces that we're dealing with have come together at the same time. Geopolitics is fundamentally changing. Demographics are changing at a rate that we've never seen. We talked about the North versus the South. Inequality continues to rise, and it's a topic that I will come back with. For 70% of the world's population, they live in economies with growing inequality. Climate is an issue that has to be solved now. It's not one that we can put off. And finally, the rate of pace of technological adoption is something that we've never seen before. Now, any one of these 5 issues could be a generational defining change. We have both the challenge and the opportunity to solve all 5 of these at the same time. So there's a unique context. So let me then go to today, to the launch of our report. And this report talks about 5 things, all under the banner of how do we drive a world that has sustainable, inclusive growth. This has been a personal passion of mine, and if I were to say one thing on this topic of sustainable, inclusive growth, It's how do we push back against the tyranny of or-based thinking? I'm often asked, Bob, do you stand for growth or inclusion? Do we want growth or do we want climate? Do we want climate or do we want inclusion? That's easy thinking. Right? Hard thinking embraces the challenge of the and, that says, really, this is a simultaneous equation. And if we want to solve inclusion, if we want to solve sustainability, if we want to solve growth, we have to solve all three at the same time. They link to each other in a synergistic way. It is not easy to solve all three, but we believe that's possible. Today's report, done in collaboration with Mr. Khan and others, lays a critical foundational pillar to start to lay the fact base that this is possible. And we have 5 important observations that I'd like to share with you. The first observation goes to a notion of redefining the floor from poverty to empowerment. Let's change our thinking from a poverty line to an empowerment line. What's the difference? We've all become accustomed to the poverty line, which effectively says, how do you get somebody to ensure that they can survive? Right? Empowerment goes beyond that. Empowerment says it's not about survival. What it's about is it's about mobility, social mobility. It's about saying, do you have a shot? So this is a line that ensures that people have basic access to infrastructure, to education, to health, to being able to be resilient. It's the minimum level that says, I have a shot. So we've defined this notion of the real aspiration should not be rising above the poverty line, it should be rising above the empowerment line. So that's the aspirational side. The challenge is 60% of the world today does not meet this standard. And when you look at specific countries, let's take India, 75% are below the empowerment line. In places like Mexico, Brazil, and China, 50% are below the empowerment line. And even in the most advanced economies, 25% are below the empowerment line. So when we raise our aspiration from poverty to empowerment, we raise the challenge. So we then did some research to say how much investment is required to solve 2 key pillars, to raise everybody to the empowerment line and to solve the world's net zero equation. What's the investment required? Well, the investment required is massive. Right? When you look at this on a global basis, it's 37 trillion US dollars to raise everybody to the empowerment line. It's a further 41 trillion US dollars to solve the net zero equation, which gives us a massive number of 78 trillion US dollars. The G20, which we're focused on today, plays the lion's share of that role as 56 trillion US dollars. Okay, so it's a big number to solve this problem. How do we actually drive enough economic growth to solve this? Where's the money going to come from? This is the second big observation. And I'll go to good news and bad news. The good news is we believe half of this gap can be solved. We have a pathway to it, and it's really driven on 2 things. How do we create an environment to drive economic growth, which can solve about 13 trillion of this equation, and further, line-of-sight innovations. These are not unknown innovations, but innovations that we know today can solve another 16 trillion. That closes half the gap. If we can create an environment that fosters economic growth and fosters innovation, we can close half the gap. The problem is we have another half to still close. And for this, we need to get creative. And we started to then do some research to say, how do we get creative? And the key to getting creative is starting by looking around the world today for pockets of innovation and figuring out how can we level up in these pockets of innovation. So let's look at these pockets of innovation. The first pocket of innovation deals with access and skilling. Right? If we can create more access and skilling. Let me give you 2 examples. On access, Mexico. Mexico has played a leading role to create trade access, not just with the US, but for countries around the world. And when you look at the economic growth of Mexico and foreign direct investment has gone up 50% in the last year alone as the world has reimagined supply chains due to its open trade policy with the rest of the world. Access has driven economic growth. Access. If we think about upskilling, I'd look at Germany as an example, and the work they have focused on apprenticeship programs for trade skills for 16-year-olds and up have led the way for the lowest unemployment rate in Europe. Access and skilling, maybe one source of innovation that we could level up in. Let's go to housing. Affordable housing becomes another beacon of light to solve this particular equation. And I start with Brazil. The program Minha Casa Minha Vida, right, has been recognized by the UN as a global lighthouse for providing creative financing to drive low-income housing across Brazil. In Indonesia cooperated with the World Bank to renovate over 250,000 low-income houses. There are examples of this that we could radiate out to provide affordable housing for all. Let's turn to healthcare. Here in India alone, the Apollo's end-to-end approach to looking at data across the value chain has unlocked massive opportunities for outcomes-based health. Data across value chains. If we can drive more data exchange in health, there's massive opportunity for access for all. If I go to nutrition and we look at China, China's Green for Grain program, which really tackled the issues of technical assistance to deal with afforestation and erosion, focused in working with farmers. The results of those programs dropped reduced soil erosion and reduced water use by 71%. This affected 8 million hectares. There is an opportunity here around a revolution through agriculture and to drive nutrition. And finally, I'll go to the UK for schooling. UK has been chronically short of teachers. And by tackling this problem from the mundane, online applications to teachers, to also looking at the more complicated, balancing workloads, changing pay, they've doubled the number of applicants. From 2019, there were 2,800 applicants for teaching. Last year, there were 50,000. You can solve this question of the teacher shortage. All of these examples exist today. None are scaled around the world. So our first observation in solving the rest of the gap is let's learn from each other. Let's learn from each other. Our research concludes with 3 simple ideas. The first is let's not wait to identify the rest of the gap before we get started. Let's move now. Closing half the gap in the rate of speed will drive further innovation that we can't see today. The second is we need to accelerate the adoption of technology. We did some work recently on the value of implementing generative AI, but we got very granular. We looked at 67 use cases across 11 industry verticals. That shows there's an additional $4 trillion of revenues every year for business if they adopt generative AI capabilities. If we accelerate generative AI through reskilling, we'll actually solve a massive chunk of this residual gap. And finally, as Mr. Kant talked about, there are financial challenges. We need to actually solve new financial instruments to make this happen. And 2 days ago, I was very excited. Brazil launched $2 billion US of sovereign bonds focused on sustainability, one of the first in the world. If that can be a lighthouse to do more to unlock financial flows from north to south, we have a shot at closing the residual gap. So let me then close with, is it all worth it? Is it all worth it? What could the world look like if we do solve this simultaneous equation of growth that is both inclusive and sustainable? Well, a few ideas just to excite us. The first is we could guarantee moving from survival to the notion that everyone has a shot. Everyone has a shot to be mobile in life. The second, we can build resilience into our system, that one bad decision doesn't permanently change the course of your life, that you can withstand an exogenous event or you can withstand one bad decision. The world would be more resilient. Third, the world would be more connected. And I think in particular today, when the world is pulling itself apart, a more connected world versus a more divided world is a healthier world. Fourth, on the idea of healthcare, there's equity and access for all that ensures we all can thrive. Next, empowerment. If we actually get to the empowerment line, everyone has the ability to participate in their communities. No voice goes unheard, And finally, on the environment, there's secure, clean, and affordable energy for all. So I think we can all agree this is the kind of world that we'd like to have. That's the conclusion of our report. And as I wrap up, I would love to proactively thank our hosts, Sonia and Vishnu, and Mr. Kant. Again, I'd like to thank you for the wonderful collaboration. Thank you all.
We need to act fast and we need to act now. The message from the McKinsey report is loud and clear, Mr. Sternfels. Thanks very much for that amazing presentation and those very stark figures reminding us of the climate emergency. Now, I also request the G20 Sherpa, Mr. Amitabh Kant, the India Managing Partner for McKinsey, Mr. Rajat Dhawan, NDTV's Editorial Director Sonia Singh, and NDTV's Executive Editor Vishnu Shom, along with Mr. Bob Sternfels, to kindly come up on stage to release the McKinsey report. Thank you very much for, ladies and gentlemen, for coming up on stage and releasing the McKinsey report. I also now invite Mr. Amitabh Kant, the G20 Sherpa for India, Mr. Rajat Dhawan, Mr. Bob Sternfels on the stage with NDTV's Editorial Director Sonia Singh and Executive Director Vishnu Shom for a conversation.
So we'd like to thank all of you for being over here. It is a fantastic report. And I think there were so many points outlined in this report which have a bearing for the entire B20 process and G20 process. But I think what we'd really like to know over here, and perhaps Rajat, you'd like to take that, is while we've spoken about and looked at the global goals of G20 and what we need to really get there, what is it that we in India need to do to achieve some of these targets?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Vishnu. And the G20 Sherpa and Bob very clearly brought out the global imperatives. I would only say that these imperatives are absolutely applicable to India. If India has to move ahead, sustainable, inclusive growth, jump-starting it and accelerating it is the only way for us to move forward because it does good for the people and the planet. Why do I say so? If you look at just the inclusion parameters for India, Bob talked about 2.6 billion people in the G20 world who are below the empowerment line, which is a higher bar. It's a $12 PPP higher bar. In India, about 1 billion of those 2.6 billion people reside. So we have about 1 billion people in India that in the coming decades have to really rise above the empowerment line so that they have a shot. You look at the climate events. Our research tells us that 75% of India's districts, roughly 600 million population in India, is subject to some climate events or the other in the coming years. These are the climate hotspots. We see it. I mean, we see the flash floods in Himachal and Uttarakhand recently. We saw the freak hurricane in Gujarat and so on and so forth. So moving on the sustainable, inclusive pathway is probably the only choice we have. Now, what kind of goals can we set? Bob talked about the goals towards 2047, 2050, which would be 100 years when for India's nationhood. I would actually say let's also look at the next 10 years, because these 10 years are the years for us to deliver escape velocity towards the 2047 goals. And I would call out 2 goals for the next 10 years. Goal number 1 is we halve the intensity of carbon emissions as a fraction of GDP in India. Today we emit about 3 gigatons of CO2 equivalent for about a 3.5 to 4 trillion economy. Is there a way we can maintain at 3 as we double the economy in the next 7 to 10 years? So that's sort of one goal. The other is a large part of these billion strong population that is below the empowerment line, we try to push above the empowerment line. These goals, are they achievable? Probably yes. What would it take for us to deliver on these goals? I would say 2 things. Firstly, tremendous amount of capital requirement. So the 56 trillion number that Bob talked about for the G20 economies is about 11 trillion for India, roughly split half and half between the inclusion goal and the climate goal, 5.5 each. What would it take for us to get 11 trillion worth of additional capital spending on the table? Again, it comes to 2 imperatives. Let's drive growth as much as possible, because growth would put money on the table. It completes the system. And the second is innovation. And again, innovation has two sides to it. One is the technological evolution, because a lot of the sustainability technologies will come into the money and so on. But on the other side, just pure business innovation on the back of digital and so on. We have seen how the entire digital stack in India has helped raise the inclusiveness quotient substantially. So innovation of both kinds, along with growth, will take us quite a lot of the distance, and as Bob called out, not the full distance. And our research tells us that on the inclusion side, good news is that about 80% of this gap in the next decade could be filled on the back of on the back of growth and innovation. On the sustainability side, the climb is a little bit stiffer. Only about 1/3 of the gap today, based on technologies that are in the money and so on, will get filled. But there is hope. I think it's a uniquely challenging pathway ahead of us, but we are ready for the challenge.
That was fascinating to hear, Rajat. I'm just going to digress for one moment from the report to ask Mr. Amitabh Kant that how are you staying so unflappable? Because we're now in the final lap. How much sleep are you getting at night right now? Are you dreaming Ukraine?
Well, I'm sleeping really well now, so it doesn't bother me because we put the developmental agenda on the forefront. We are not responsible for the Ukraine war at all. So we keep it at the back. Our objective is to really put all the issues of the developing countries right in the forefront, which are issues which Bob has talked about, issues of sustainable development goals, issues of growth, issues of climate, issues of technological transformation, issues of women-led development. Those are the issues we brought forefront.
So I think that's a really important point. Focus on our shared goals. Let's not focus on what we're diverging on. And given that, what do you think are the shared goals the economies of the G20 currently share? What can we converge on, which is really the top 3 action points you'd like to see after this?
So if you look around, I think to my mind, there are some major trends across the world. And first of which is the digital transformation taking place in the world. And that digital transformation is moving away from the kind of innovation which big tech had done in America and Europe. So you've seen innovation coming out of Google, Meta, Amazon, Apple, and in China you saw it out of Tencent and Alibaba. What India has demonstrated is that you could create public interest layers on top of which private sector innovates. And you have open source, open API, interoperable model, and that is what we've driven across. And to my mind, in India's case, the data is owned by the citizens. So this is the model for the world. There is no other model for the world. So that digital transformation which is taking place will be one where the digital empowerment of data to the citizens will be critical. Models will be based on open source, open API, and interoperability, which will allow much more innovation to take place. And that is what is happening now. So that's one digital transformation which is taking place in the world. The second is a huge energy transition which will take place in the world. The world will move from fossil fuel to clean fuels. And that is imperative for the world, to my mind. There'll be a just energy transition in the world. We in India have done about 185 gigawatt of clean energy. We are from renewable, we are now cracking water to produce green hydrogen. We import 200 billion worth of fossil fuel. Our objective is that by 2047, we should be an exporter of clean energy rather than an importer of fossil fuel energy. And that is what we are driving today. The third trend, to my mind, which is taking place across the world, is that growth is shifting. You know, in 2008, when G20 started, developed world had about close to 70% of the GDP. The developing countries had just about 28. If you look at today, the share of the developed world has come down very radically, and the share of developing countries has gone up very substantially. So the global south role has enhanced very substantially. And if, as I said, IMF says this year 80% of the global growth is going to come from global south, and next 2 decades, global south will be the key driver of growth. Then you need resources to flow into the global south to drive growth. These are 3 clear, distinct transitions taking place in the world, and everybody must be clear that these are trends which will drive corporates. These are trends which will drive countries.
Mr. Sternfeld, you spoke about economic empowerment and meeting net zero commitments, and that, it's not one or the other, both have to work hand in hand. But how would you respond to those who say that countries like India, several other developing countries in the world, have not really been the biggest polluters? The biggest polluters have been countries in the West. And yet we've got enormous economic aspirations. So is the expectation of India to meet these targets in the time allotted really realistic, considering that we've got 1 billion plus and we have huge economic requirements?
I think it's a great question, and I come back to a word I used in the beginning, which is and versus or, right? The question almost frames an or, right? Is this the developed world or India? And my answer back around this is that we don't have a choice. And where I'm rooted in this, though, is perhaps a more sophisticated look at how do we really tackle the notion of climate change. And we've done some research that comes back to, well, what is the investment required around this? And when you break it down on an annual basis globally, it's about $9 trillion of investment, US dollars, required every year to actually solve the world's climate change challenge. Now, the interesting part is I said investment, not cost. The reason I said investment is we've also identified $11 trillion of annual revenue potential from greener technologies. Some of those Mr. Kant talked about. But if we took a broader definition of these technologies and looked across the entire chain, renewables is part of it, investing in more efficient infrastructure, building technologies, 40% of the world's carbon comes through current building technologies. How do we revolutionize building technologies? And looking at notions of capture and sequestration while we're in the process of transition. When we look at these, clearly there's a dominant investment that has to occur in the developed economies, clearly. But there's also opportunities for India. And this is where I come back to this notion of I think it's an and-based question versus an or-based question.
Mr. Dhawan, talking about closing the empowerment gap, as Mr. Kant pointed out, the digital innovation being driven by India. In fact, our digital public infrastructure is now better than anywhere in the world, including the United States, and really a model for the world. How do you see this and the fact that how it's transformed the delivery of government welfare schemes, when you talk about empowerment, going into the bank accounts directly, in many cases, of women? So that really has been a major shift as well. They're going directly into the bank accounts of women. How do you see that as closing the empowerment gap, not just in India, but in countries across the world?
No, it has been, India has really innovated on creating a digital public infrastructure stack that is just just benchmark, right? And I think even countries in the developed world are now wanting to learn from India's journey over the last 10 years. And particularly between sustainability and inclusion, particularly the impact of this digital infrastructure on the inclusion goals has been superb. Just take financial inclusion as an example. From somewhere around 40 to 45% people who had bank accounts. Today, that number is closer to 85%, just on the back of the ability of the UID, the Aadhaar, to provide all the KYC requirements and so on, right? So, look, and the financial inclusion starts to change the game. Again, going back to Bob's point, it's not just about survival, but somebody who has a shot at social mobility and going up. And once you have the financial inclusion sorted out, you have optionality on the table. Vis-a-vis nutrition, vis-a-vis healthcare, vis-a-vis education, and so on and so forth. So we are very sanguine that we are at a pretty important point where we can accelerate from here on the back of the fabric that has been built.
Mr. Kant, one last question to you as we start wrapping this up. You know, we are now the most populous nation in the world. It's called India's demographic dividend. But that dividend only starts paying rewards if we can reskill and upskill and generate jobs. You know, as you look at 2047 and our targets over there, how important is it for us to work on reskilling and employment through that prism?
Very important. I think important thing is for India to grow at about 8 to 9% plus for the next 3 decades, year after year, year after year. 3 decades is important because several other countries have done it for 3 decades, and that's critical. And that means that India needs to fire on all cylinders, not just services. We need to become a manufacturing nation to create jobs. We need to enhance our agricultural productivity. We need to do urbanization in a very sustainable manner because we'll see close to 400 to 500 million people getting into the process of urbanization. So that's very important. But the most important of all is that we'll be the skilled capital of the world. We'll be providing, in 2047, India will be providing close to 28 to 30% of the skilled manpower to the world. There'll be Indian general managers in 5-star hotels, there'll be Indian electricians, Indian plumbers, all over the world. Indians will be capturing the world. And therefore, we need to train them, skill them for what the world will require at that point of time. And that has to be the #1 priority of India, which is what the skilling ministry is doing right now.
Mr. Kant, final question before you go. Now, of course, we've got it's a culmination of your work, I think, for must be about 3 years now. That's the big summit coming up. What is it going to be like? We've got China's premier arriving. Do we have confirmation of that yet?
So I wouldn't like to comment on who's coming, who's not coming. That will be unfair for me to comment at this stage. Let things unfold. But all I can say is that, as the Prime Minister himself has said, that you can rest assured that our presidency will be very, very inclusive. It'll be very decisive, it'll be ambitious and action-oriented, and that will get reflected in what the leaders say during the leaders. It's eventually a leaders' summit, so you will see that getting demonstrated, what the Prime Minister had said initially.
And Delhi shutting down, you told people of Delhi that they should travel out while the summit is on.
I think it's important to say this right in the beginning, that people of Delhi should try and travel out, because you'll have close to 40 to 43 heads of states, and their security is critical. There'll be movements, and those of you who can take a holiday outside Delhi will be good, and it'll be a well-earned holiday for all of you. And those who are coming from outside to Delhi should try and move into other cities during that time.
And the world watched the moon landing. Is the world going to be watching again? Because this is the G20's moonshot moment.
I think greatly inspirational moment, and one is we were all overwhelmed by what our scientists have achieved, and when today morning the Prime Minister addressed the scientists, it was extremely inspirational, and it was extremely motivating for everyone in India.
All right, well, thank you so much for being with us. It's a truly spectacular report because it covers so much, you know, in its canvas and its scope, and hopefully going forward, well beyond this G20 session, you know, we'll have a lot to think about. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, Mr. Kant, Mr. Sternfels, Mr. Rajat Dhawan, Sonia Singh, and Vishnu Shom for that very insightful conversation, highlighting the India global moment through the G20 and highlighting the crucial issues that will be discussed here in the national capital in just about a week from now. And the next interview that we have lined up for you in today's conclave is truly special, and it is to discuss some of the crucial issues that the world economy is facing at large and some of the crucial issues that will be discussed in the G20 summit that India is hosting next weekend. One sentence that you must have heard over the last few months repeatedly coming in from the government and coming in from the top global voices is that India is fast becoming the voice of the global south through its G20 presidency. Now, one top voice of the country echoing this thought has been the Union Minister for Housing and Urban Affairs and Petroleum and Natural Gas, Mr. Hardeep Singh Puri. We'll have Mr. Puri among us for a very special discussion to discuss India's fuel diplomacy, to discuss the transition to cleaner fuel, and to discuss the other pressing issues with respect to fuel, natural gas, that will be discussed at the G20 summit next week. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, ladies and gentlemen, the fuel prices last year had shot up to a record high, as many of you might be aware. The Brent crude prices went up to around $130 per barrel, which is a record high. While now the prices have started coming down, the cost of living crisis that several countries are facing because of rising fuel prices and because of rising commodity prices, that cost of living crisis has not normalized as yet. Along with the cost of living crisis, the other crisis, of course, is of climate that we at the NDTV Conclave have been repeatedly highlighting as it's going to be a key priority for the discussion of the G20 leaders next weekend. And one important issue that India has been raising throughout its conversations with the G20 leaders and on the global platforms regarding other meetings as well has been of climate finance. Fixing the responsibility for climate change, ladies and gentlemen. When some countries have contributed to climate change more than the others, should the responsibility and should the costs be equally divided, or should they be equitably divided? That is one question that has been facing the world today, and that is one question that India hopes to raise even at the G20 summit that will be held here in the national capital. We'll be joined by the Union Minister, Mr. Hardeep Singh Puri, in just a short while from now. He'll be joining us any moment now for a special interview to discuss all these issues that India has been facing, and not just India, that the world has been facing as well. As you all might be aware that India has several goals that it has fixed for energy transition, for transition to cleaner sources of fuel. For 2030, India has a goal to meet 50% of its energy requirements from renewable sources of energy. That means reducing total projected carbon emissions by about 1 billion tons. Now, where are we on that goal till now? In 2023, according to the government's own data, the share of non-fossil fuel installed capacity in India is around 43%. And we have the target of 50% to achieve by 2030. Along with transition to cleaner sources of energy, energy diplomacy and rising fuel prices have also been a key point of discussion globally. They've emerged as a rather crucial discussion at a time when India's fuel diplomacy, especially importing fuel from Russia, has raised eyebrows in several countries, especially the West, including some of the closest allies for India. While the government has been saying that those decisions have been made, keeping India's interests at front and keeping India's economic interests, to keep the prices in control, those priorities have been kept at the top when it comes to India's fuel diplomacy. These are some of the questions, these are some of the issues that we will discuss today with the session with Mr. Hardeep Puri, who will be joining us in just a short while from now. We will also discuss, as we've been highlighting through the day, the climate change emergency, the energy transition emergency, because as it has been highlighted repeatedly now over the last 1 year, in fact over the last several years, that the time to act is now. And India's goal to meet the 50% target by 2030, many experts say that for now is going well on track. Currently we're at 43%, but we hope to go to 50% by 2030. But there are several questions on whether even that is enough, considering that we have already come a long way. We have already passed several critical junctures of climate change, which will now need a lot more effort to reverse. We are honored to have among us the Union Minister for Petroleum and Gas, Mr. Hardeep Singh Puri, who are joining us. I request Mr. Puri to come to the stage for a conversation with NDTV's senior anchor and consulting editor, Sanket Upadhyay.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for attending this program. G20, its meaning for India, what we hope to achieve as a country, and what we are doing and what we are learning as a process. More importantly, if we talk specifically, ekdam specific agar hum baat kare, how do you rethink fuel? And I don't think there'll be a better person to answer questions along these lines than the Union Minister for Petroleum and Natural Gas and Minister for Urban Affairs, Ambassador Hardeep Singh Puri. And I insist on calling you Ambassador first. Thank you very much, Ambassador Puri.
Thank you very much for having me here today. And I have no difficulty in you calling me an ambassador or whatever you like. Certainly, I've been an ambassador longer than I've been a minister. Thank you. You started with the G20 and then you fast forwarded to rethinking fuel. So I'll spend a minute or two or three, if you permit,
sure,
to talk about G20, and then I will come to, fossil fuel transition, rethinking fuel. First and foremost, I think in every discussion, the context is most important. And the G20 Presidency of India came at a time when the world was facing multiple crises. The G20 itself was born in a moment of crisis. In 2008, when there was a world financial and economic crisis, the global institutions did not know how to deal with that crisis. So they elevated the G20, which was a grouping at the level of finance ministers, and made it into a summit-level group. And the G20 summit in London 2010 helped address that, because the IMF, World Bank, the GATT or WTO could not address it. But the G20 Presidency of India is taking place when the world is facing three crises. Beech mein, there wasn't that kind of turbulence. You've got three crises: fuel, food, and fertilizer. But I think the interesting thing is, India, during this period, not only now of course, we are on the moon and over the moon, but India's figures generally are looking very, very impressive. And if you give me time later, I'd like to reel off what was the situation in 2014 and what is the situation now, 9 years later, and that adds to an overall spirit of elation.
Mm-hmm. How about now? We can begin now. You can tell us.
Well, I can tell you, I'll be very happy. I've been doing some research in the morning before I came here. So there are things that you know and there are things which you don't know. Foreign direct investment and FDI will take place when the foreign direct investor, who's a private entity, feels that there is economic opportunity. You're looking at an average of 22 billion. Today, you're looking at an average of 46 billion per annum. Mutual fund investment, 2013 was 100 billion. Today, it's 500 billion. The electrification of railways, 2013 was 4,100 kilometers. Today, it's 28,100 kilometers. The corporate tax rate then was 33.9%. Now it's down to 22%. Retail or RBI CPI inflation 10% down in last year, not even this year, down to 4.7%. Direct benefit transfer, you know, money that you transfer to the beneficiaries of all our schemes, it's very interesting, from 0.89 billion, that's less than 1 billion, now it's 32 billion. Then I give you national highways. 2014 में 25,700 किलोमीटर थी, आज 53,700 किलोमीटर. एयरपोर्ट 74 थे, आज 178 है, 148. Digital transactions as a percentage of GDP. Now this I find most impressive. 2016 में 4.4%. Today 76.1%. Number of IITs which we had 2014 में 16 थी, 2023 में 23 है. Number of IIMs 2014 में 13 थी, आज 20 है. Look, I can go on and on.
Yeah.
But the feel-good factor in India, where India has traveled, and that is reflected in turn in the fact that you've moved from being the 10th largest economy to the 5th largest economy. जब मैं कुछ वर्ष पहले कहता था that we are going to be a $5 trillion economy, some of my friends, I don't know how to describe them. Their friendship, I think, has never been in doubt. Their liberal wonkiness was in doubt. ये सर कभी $5 trillion इतने challenges है, right? Challenges तो हैं, और challenges तो आज भी हैं. But today, when you talk in terms of being a, let's say, $10 trillion economy by 2030, no one has any doubt. और आप आगे बढ़ते. By the way, ये जो मैंने आपको रील आउट स्टैटिस्टिक्स किए थे, ये रोल आउट किए, मेरे नहीं हैं, ये मॉर्गन स्टैनली के हैं. आज सुबह मैंने एक रिपोर्ट पढ़ी, and the preambular was, and I'll conclude with that, and forgive me, I'm not trying to say this, not my view, Morgan Stanley's views, India's future looks like China's past. I think that sums up that growth area, the growth potential that India demonstrated in the last 9 years and the years ahead. And he's recalling China's past. I'm not saying China will not have a great future. I don't know. I don't study the Chinese economy in that detail. But there are fault lines there. Some sectors of that economy are under strain. The real estate sector to begin with, about which I know a little. But now I want to fast forward to fuel.
And before Ambassador Puri, you answer questions on fuel, this point that you made on $5 trillion economy, some of your friends, since you mentioned them, उनका ये भी कहना था कि ये तो अपने आप ही हो रहा था. The whole theory of compounding. तो आपने ऐसा क्या किया?
आप उनसे ये सवाल पूछिए, अगर अपने आप ही हो रहा था, आपने क्रेडिट क्यों नहीं ले लिया? जब हम कह रहे थे, जो मैं बात कर रहा हूँ 2017-18 के बाद, जब मैं मंत्रिमंडल में आया, तो मैंने ऐसी बातें करनी शुरू की थी, ये तो हो ही नहीं सकता, असंभव है. अगर अपने आप हो रहा था, ईश्वर से हमने काम किया, उसके कारण हो रहा है. But you know, I mean, frankly, I think every one of us, when we get up in the morning, we can decide how much of a fool we want to make of ourselves that day. You know, it's in a democracy like India, where there is freedom of speech, freedom of action, you can get up and make an outlandish statement. You start cataloging what they've been saying. भाग जाते हैं, but you know, this is a shoot and scoot politics. शुरू से कोई बेवकूफ़ी की बात करते हैं, and then when they say, यार ये तो गलत हो गया, फिर change the subject. But if you want me to come to fuel.
Yeah, from fool, let's come to fuel.
Good one. देखिए, ऐसा है, मैं आपके सामने एक proposition रखता हूँ, और वो ये है कि आप मान लीजिए कि आपके पास बहुत बड़ा न्यूक्लियर आर्सेनल है. उसका न्यूक्लियर आर्सेनल by itself does not translate itself into political or economic or global standing. Because it is entirely conceivable that you can have a large nuclear arsenal and yet you can have a large country disintegrate. Point one. Point two, there are some things which are clear indicators or clear providers of how an economy is going. And I submit to you, fuel consumption is one such indicator. Why am I saying this? India's fuel consumption today, on an average, is 3 times the global average. How do I say that? if there may be a pandemic, there may be slowdown, there's drop in demand, but if global growth, demand grows by 1%, India's grows 3%. Fuel consumption is a very good indicator of the state of your economy. That's the first position. The second one, when you talk about transition or rethinking fuel,
Yes.
what are you rethinking? You're not rethinking energy. You are rethinking clean energy. In other words, अगर आपकी dependence on fossil fuel was 100%, how much is it today? All right, I give you a starting point since we are talking about my erstwhile, no, they are still my friends. Their political tags are a little in doubt. 2014 तक, और मैं आपको अपना एक्सपीरियंस बताता हूं, जब मैं 2002 की बात है, 3 की बात है, जब मैं ब्राजील में 6 की बात है, 2006 में जब मैं ब्राजील गया एज इंडियाज एम्बेसडर, हमने बड़ी कोशिश की कि हमारी उनके साथ कोलैबोरेशन बायोफ्यूल्स में हो। तो उस समय भी मेरी पोजीशन थी और आज भी है कि आप किसी चीज को में सफलता अगर लाना चाहते हैं तो पहले आप जो आपकी नीति है, पॉलिसी है, उसको सही तरीके से लाइए। सो व्हेन मिस्टर पवार वाज द आई थिंक एग्रीकल्चर मिनिस्टर and he has a very firm grounding in the sugar politics and so on, उस समय एक निर्णय लिया गया कि हमारी 10 स्टेट्स और यूनियन टेरिटरीज में हम 5% बायोफ्यूल्स ब्लेंडिंग करेंगे और पूरा दम लगा लिया। जब हम 2014 तक पहुंचे, so I think the amount of biofuels we were blending was about 1.5% or little less or little more. So what went wrong in those years? I'm talking about 2006 to 2014. And what went right after 2014 onwards? Well, I'll fast forward. We were around 1.5% in 2014. Today, we are blending, I think, 12% or thereabouts.
Yeah, 11.7% to be precise.
11.7% is what we are doing now. We have a 12% target, I think, till the end of the year. So we are on that 12% thing. But there's another target, and that target is that we wanted to do 20% blending by 2030. And the Honorable Prime Minister has brought that forward to 2025. अच्छा, मैं आपको एक फिगर देता हूं। जब हमने 10% ब्लेंडिंग की, और ये 10% ब्लेंडिंग का हमारा टारगेट था नवंबर 2022 तक, और हमने 5 महीने टारगेट डेट से पहले कर ली। जब हमने 10% ब्लेंडिंग की तो हमारी सेविंग ऑन दी इंपोर्ट बिल वाज 41,000 करोड़, और 41,000 करोड़ जो हमने बचाया, हमने 42,000 करोड़ अपने फार्मर्स को दिया। अगर हम 20% ब्लेंडिंग करते हैं, which is around the corner, so what will be the saving on this thing? You can calculate based on then prevailing international price, but that's not my point. It's not the amount of money you're saving. Please look at the boost that agriculture receives as a result of biofuel. So you're rethinking fuel, you're also providing a boost to your agriculture. And now I want to go forward, because I'm sure you don't want to take all the time on fuels, but
before we move beyond fuels, एक सवाल, ये जो blending की आप बात कर रहे हैं उसी से जुड़ी हुई है। For a lay person who's driving his car, उसका पहले आपने बताया 1.53% blending थी, मतलब पेट्रोल में इतना इथेनॉल, वो बढ़ा करके 11.7% कर दिया। Now you've set a target of 20. By 2025 this will also happen. एक कंसर्न ये आता है कि मेरी गाड़ी में पेट्रोल की जगह ये मिक्स क्या चीज आ रही है, and is it safe?
देखिए,
so while you save money, that's a different thing. Why is it? How do you convince people that this is right?
No, I don't need to convince people. The convincing is taking place on its own. Technical studies had shown कि आपकी अगर बायोफ्यूल ब्लेंडिंग 20% होती है तो आपको गाड़ी के इंजन में कोई पार्ट्स में कोई बदलाव करने की ज़रूरत नहीं है, उसमें कोई कोरोजन ज़्यादा नहीं होगी, कुछ ऐसा नहीं। दिस वाज द कन्वेंशनल थिंकिंग, एंड आई मेक दिस सबमिशन टू यू, उस थिंकिंग के कारण हमारा माइंड सेट भी वो 20% पे रुक गया। जब मैं नया नया पेट्रोलियम और नेचुरल गैस विभाग से जुड़ा, बात कर रहा हूँ मैं जुलाई 2021 में, तो मुझसे एक बहुत सीनियर हमारे कॉलीग, उनसे पूछा ये आप 20% पे क्यों रुके हुए हैं? तो मैंने एक्सप्लेनेशन ये दिया कि ये टेक्निकली ऑटोमोबाइल एसोसिएशन, क्या नाम है, SIAM, सोसाइटी ऑफ इंडियन ऑटोमोबाइल मैन्युफैक्चरर्स, दे आर यूज्ड टू engines which are doing very well, they're all, God bless them, making enough money. तो उनसे बात हुई तो उन्होंने कहा कि अच्छा 20% तक तो चल जाएगा पर उसके आगे नहीं। तो मैंने उनसे कहा, जब मैं ब्राज़ील में पोस्टेड था, मैं राजदूत था ब्राज़ील में, तो उस समय ब्राज़ील में तो आप पेट्रोल पंप में जाके और डिपेंडिंग ऑन द प्राइस ऑफ पेट्रोल एंड एथेनॉल इन अ डे और ऑन बोर्ड यू कैन टेक अ डिसीजन। अगर मान लीजिए पेट्रोल का दाम नीचे, आप तय करिए कि आप 100% पेट्रोल डलवा लेते हैं, अगर उसका एथेनॉल का दाम बहुत कम है तो आप 100% एथेनॉल डलवा लेती है, बट दोज कार्स आर मैन्युफैक्चर्ड टू दोज स्पेसिफिकेशन। हमने जब इस पे एक्सपेरिमेंट किया तो हमें बिल्कुल क्लियर था कि 20% तक कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं है। तो हमने शायद अप्रैल इस साल, इफ आई मेमोरी सर्व्स मी राइट, वी स्टार्टेड introducing what is called E20, or E20 is 20% blended fuel. And if memory serves me right, the latest figure I saw is कि 2000 पंप्स हैं जहाँ पे E20 बिक रहा है। अच्छा, आप ये देखिए कि इसमें मैंने I was gave you the example of my senior colleague who questioned me. मैंने कहा कि इसका रीज़न ये था, पर मेरी चिंता कुछ और है। मेरी चिंता ये थी उस समय कि हम मान लीजिए 20% से ज़्यादा टारगेट रख देते हैं, do we have the resilience in the system to ensure that the amount of ethanol required, and we've diversified the feed, हम अभी मक्का से भी बनवाते हैं, हम from sugar, from bamboo second generation, we are also making it from agricultural waste, from parali. Will we be able to get that? Today I can tell you with confidence that two things have happened. एक तो मैंने एक I took a small step, but I think it had its impact. I invited my Brazilian counterpart, और मैंने उनको रिक्वेस्ट किया कि आप अपनी जो ऑटोमोबाइल मैन्युफैक्चरर्स हैं उनकी एक डेलीगेशन साथ में लाना। और ऑटोमोबाइल जो मैन्युफैक्चरर्स हैं ब्राज़ील में, कंपनीज तो वही हैं, वही जर्मन कंपनीज हैं, वही जापानी कंपनी है। तो मेरे बड़ी खुशी हुई, बिकॉज जब वो यहाँ आए, अगर भाई ब्राज़ील में चल सकती है 20% से ज़्यादा वाली एथेनॉल वाली गाड़ी, तो यहाँ क्यों नहीं चल सकती? मैन्युफैक्चरर तो वही है, इट्स नॉट एज इफ इट्स अ डिफरेंट मैन्युफैक्चरर। एंड आई एम वेरी हैप्पी टू इन्फॉर्म यू that I'm very clear that the kind of cars which are coming in here now are called E85. Matlab, they will be able to take biofuels up to 85%. Oh, wow. So, we have overcome that. Second, we have not stopped at this. We are now looking at the green hydrogen. First, let me go to compressed biogas, natural gas. Sure. I'm very happy when we were walking in, whoever was your master of ceremonies was describing me as the Minister of Petroleum and Gas. I said, I like the second part. But no, it's natural gas. There's a difference between natural gas and liquefied petroleum gas. Let me give you what the difference is. Liquefied petroleum gas, which is a pure cooking medium, that is what my OMCs have to sometimes carry on their shoulders when there are torrential rains and deliver. Natural gas is used in automobiles, it's used in the industrial sector, it's used in a variety. Now, liquefied petroleum gas is made from crude oil, the other one comes out. So what are we doing? We are increasing the percentage of gas in our fuel mix from 6% to 15%. We're well on the way. And it's going to cost about an investment of $60 billion. It's taking place. We have just now, if memory serves me right, otherwise my young friend will correct me, we have about 7 liquefying stations. You see, gas is not transported across the sea. You come in liquid form, it comes to the port of arrival, there it is gasified, then it comes through a pipeline. So what have we done on the pipeline? That's very important. 2014 में हमारी टोटल पाइपलाइन जो देश में थी 14,500 किलोमीटर थी. हमारा टारगेट है 33,000 किलोमीटर से ज्यादा. आज with great pride I tell you the country has already achieved about 23,000 kilometers. And we will take it from 23,000 kilometers to 33,000 kilometers. So natural gas usage in the economy will go up. When I meet with my explorers, I had a delegation from outside last night. I took a review of this thing. I think gas production in the last 2 years has gone up by 18-20%. So we are trying to increase gas domestic production. Unlike crude oil, where we are dependent on imports to about 80% or so, in the case of natural gas, we are 50% or so. Now,
लेकिन Ambassador Puri, natural gas के लिए, for instance, let's talk about its use as a piped natural gas. It requires infrastructure. मैं अगर चाहूँ भी इस्तेमाल करना, अगर मेरे घर तक पाइप नहीं आ रही है, so that may be a problem. I'll have to depend on LPG. So in terms of that penetration, are we?
No, I think 98% तो पहुंच गई है. But वो problem क्या है मैं बताता हूँ. Pipeline is covering 98% of the geographical area. Difficulty क्या है? Last mile connectivity है. और मैं किसी की निंदा नहीं करना चाहता हूँ. Last of all मेरी अपने constituents की. ऐसा है कि अगर आप लीजिए ये पाइप यहाँ से ले जाते हैं किसी अर्बन सेंटर में और वहाँ पे एक हाई राइज बिल्डिंग है, वहाँ तो बड़ा आसान है, एक कनेक्शन दो और 300 कंज्यूमर सेटिस्फाई हो गए. पर जहाँ आपकी जनसंख्या जो है वो डिस्पर्स्ड है, जहाँ आपकी पॉपुलेशन जो है वो एक घर है और अगला वाला 4 किलोमीटर दूर है, 6 किलोमीटर दूर है, तो कुछ वो उसमें देरी हो रही है. बट आई थिंक द फिगर्स आर वेरी इंप्रेसिव. I think geographically we've already covered 98% of the area. But I think the more important thing is I need to get the CNG there because it's much cheaper than liquefied petroleum gas. So rest assured, I'm fighting all the time with the fighting, not individuals, fighting the bottlenecks. Because you've laid out a CGD pipeline, you've laid down other things, but things, believe me, the progress is fantastic. By the way, all the connections are going up. जो एलपीजी कनेक्शन थे वो 2014 में शायद 14 करोड़ थे, वो आज 33 करोड़ हैं. और इसमें भी सीएनजी 25 लाख थे, वो 1 करोड़ से ऊपर आ गए हैं. पर माय आइडिया इज टू इंक्रीज द टोटल नंबर ऑफ यूजर्स मच मोर. करेक्ट. सो यू विल हैव अ सिचुएशन वेयर पीपल विल हैव द piped gas coming in. They will also hopefully buy my solar cooker, do other things. So you're rethinking fuel. But we don't stop here. But I think the fuel of the future really is green hydrogen. ये मान के चलिए fossil fuel तो इतना सा जितना भी है, आज से 10, 15, 20 साल के बाद people will just not want to use it. Why? Because alternates will be available. What does green hydrogen require? Green hydrogen requires two things. One is a capacity कि आप green energy जो solar energy है उसको, और हमने ये demonstrate किया, पहले 25 सेंट पर यूनिट थी, आज हम उसको गिरवा के 3 सेंट पर यूनिट पर ले आए हैं. और you need electrolyzers. And today I can tell you that we have within the country every possible conceivable electrolyzer manufacturer in the world is tied up here. Why? Because green hydrogen will succeed where you have domestic demand, you have domestic production and domestic consumption. इसलिए मैं, again, I'm not trying to criticize anyone. Green hydrogen will succeed in India. But if you tell me that you can make green hydrogen in some desert 10,000 kilometers away and then transport it, no. A gas does not lend itself to transportation. I mean, you can, but it's a very costly business. What you can transport and export, which Indian companies are doing now, is green ammonia. So today, green hydrogen, अगले कुछ दिनों में I'm looking at different possibilities. The fuel cell. Now you've got cars which are coming in, very strong rollout of electric vehicles. You've got cars which are coming in which are in hybrid mode, those which are using the fuel cell. One of my companies has been, IOCL has been after me कि एक वो बड़ी हाइड्रोजन बस है, उस पर करना चाहिए. देखिए, इसमें कोई सीक्वेंशियलिटी नहीं होगी कि आज तक हम ये यूज करेंगे, अगले दिन ये सब इकट्ठा चलेगा. बट आई थिंक बाय द टाइम वी रीच 2025 वी विल हैव अ वेरी इंटरेस्टिंग सिचुएशन. 2025 में 20% biofuel blending hogi, we would have shed our inhibition, and I call it an inhibition, because if E85 vehicles are slowly beginning to come in, then you will do more biofuel. Plus, now I get pressure from all the feed providers. By feed providers are maize. A lot of people say, sir, aap maize aur khareediye, aap sugar cane aur khareediye. So it's adding to the agricultural momentum. And then when you do this, the CNG increases, number of cars on CNG. When the CNG prices went up, I was very worried. I said, I hope the automobile manufacturers don't hold back. But no, they are quite happy in now rolling out more and more CNG cars. So I think in many ways, India represents, and that is the real India story. Chandrayaan, on the moon, over the moon, complete transformation in terms of the automobile. And we are one of the largest automobile manufacturers in the world. And on top of that, you take this fuel, because rethinking fuel is not just personal automobile. You look at your urban transport system. Our metro system is going to be the second largest in the world after China, overtaking the US. But more than that, the Prime Minister just approved how many 10,000 electric buses for city operations. So, I mean, when Mr. Kejriwal matures from his Revdi politics into mature politics, he will discuss that instead of cannibalizing the old fleet, it's better to accelerate the electric vehicles coming in based on an agreed, transparent and predictable method of funding and operation.
Ambassador Puri, this point that you made about green hydrogen being the future fuel, किसी भी ईंधन को mass acceptability मिलने के लिए वो readily available होना चाहिए, उसका एक infrastructure तैयार होना चाहिए. इसकी pipeline के बारे में आप क्या बता सकते हैं?
मुझे आपका जो mass acceptability and that benefits to the fathers first, I love that because that's what our operating philosophy is. देखिए, ये समय समय की बात होती है. जब गैस सिलेंडर शुरू हुआ, मैं बात कर रहा हूँ मेरे अपने childhood, and I'm very old, so it must have been many years ago. वो गैस सिलेंडर मिलने में ऐसे लगता था कि बड़े आपने बहुत बड़ी चीज़ कुछ हासिल कर ली if you manage to get a gas cylinder. Why? Because our mothers and sisters were spared the toxicity which comes in a kitchen, okay? Because they were using wet wood, they were using coal. I remember when I was a child, my grandmother used to use a koile ki angithi, and you know, used to fuel it by उसमें हवा में छोटी सी opening होती थी, उसमें कोयला पड़ता था, कभी वो गीला होता था, and the whole small place we lived in was completely You move from there. Today a gas cylinder, बाकी तो छोड़िए, उज्ज्वला स्कीम में हमने 9 करोड़ 60 लाख gas cylinder दे दिए. So acceptability and to the farthest first, I think Ujjwala is a scheme which showed it. जब महामारी के दौरान जब लॉकडाउन था तो हमने 3 सिलेंडर फ्री दिए to every beneficiary. And this is where it goes to the below the poverty line, economically weaker section. If 9.6 crore cylinders has to increase to 10 crores, if there's demand, we'll do it. So the person who is the most vulnerable is the highest priority. So I come to that. So you start with that. Secondly, insofar as fuel is concerned, please note that today 70% of our traffic on the roads, vehicular traffic, is of two-wheelers and three-wheelers. That's where the common man comes in. And they are using battery operated. But the cost of all these fuels, whether it's ethanol made from different feeds like second generation bamboo, third generation gases, or second generation agricultural waste, the cost keeps coming down, but you have to scale up. I think green hydrogen is precisely one such case. Once the cost of electrolyzers, the domestically manufactured, because then you need what? You need sunshine, you need water, and you need an electrolyzer, because solar ka cost niche le aaya hai. And the success will come from our refineries. Abhi hamari 11 refineries hai ek company ki. Already 2 they are doing, and I'm coaxing him one of these days, we'll get him to announce it. He's using another 2 for this thing. Once that comes, cost comes down. But I still think you have to go through the progression, through batteries, because 70% is that.
Correct.
Two-wheelers and three-wheeler. Then you go to four-wheelers, then you go from existing fuels to cleaner fuels. All that is happening simultaneously.
So that transitioning, I understand, that point you made. But I'm sure you must be having some sort of a blueprint or an idea or a timeline to which you would successfully tell yourself that, okay, now, I in 2023, in a hall, I had said that this is the fuel of the future. This is what I think. By this time, it will be the fuel.
See, I'll tell you, much of this is about what is called the popular narrative. जब मैं शायद 2021 में माननीय प्रधानमंत्री जी जब देश को संबोधित कर रहे थे लाल किले से, तो उन्होंने तब कहा था कि we are going to take up green hydrogen in mission mode. All right? Many smart and enlightened anchors after that asked me, क्या हो रहा है? अभी तक कुछ हुआ नहीं कभी. देखिए, एक country की transition करवानी एक point से दूसरे point तक, you need to have your ecosystems right. So what were the ecosystems that he did? When the PM says something from the Red Fort, take it, he means it, and he'll get it done, especially this PM. उन्होंने 2014, 15 अगस्त को जब संबोधित किया था, he said, the greatest tribute we can pay to the father of the nation when we celebrate his 150th birth anniversary is to make India open defecation free. 2014 में कहा था, हो गया 2019 में, एक स्टेट नहीं हुई, but वो भी हो गई अब. तो ये पॉलिसी प्रोनाउंसमेंट्स एंड इकोसिस्टम ट्रांसफॉर्मेशन, 2 steps आई टेल यू. एक कैबिनेट डिसीजन हुआ, आई थिंक इट वाज फैंटास्टिक, कि 17,000 करोड़ शायद हमारी जो PLI स्कीम है, प्रोडक्टिविटी लिंक्ड इंसेंटिव स्कीम, उसमें इलेक्ट्रोलाइजर मैन्युफैक्चर वाज इंक्लूडेड एंड इट वर्क. नाउ यू हैव, एज आई सेड, just about every, I'm not saying they're all drawing from the PLI scheme. They're coming here because they see economic potential and they see the, I'll be very frank, ability to make money. Also, foreign investors, they're not going to come out of philanthropy or altruism. They will come because there's an economic opportunity. Then, there was another decision taken whereby specific responsibilities were given. Okay, what can the steel sector do, what can we do? So I think we've got the basics in right. I tend to make statements more on the cautionary side. I have now seen one economic entity has brought in, what, $32 billion of investment from other places. Why are they investing in India? Because they think India is a place where green hydrogen research, manufacture will take place, and ultimately India will be a staging point for the other. You know, the most important question you have to answer is, till when will fossil fuels be a viable, competitive thing? And that's the most important. Because if we go at the current level, you've got 2 competing global trends. One is those who say, fossil fuels ko ekdam khatam karo. Bhai, agar aap fossil fuels ko khatam karna chahte ho, and you want only green energy, then you must make the investment in the green energy. Because there's no point telling a guy who can buy a liter of petrol for, say, 85 rupees in a BJP-ruled state and 108 in a non-BJP ruled state, कि आप ये मत खरीदिए, आप green hydrogen पे खरीदिए, where the corresponding cost is twice. So the 2 processes will take place simultaneously. And my answer to your question is, this will happen sooner than later.
Fantastic. Now, my next question, and we are coming to the close of this session. You see, whatever fuel we use, there is a concern of pollution and its impact on climate change, right? That is always a driving force when, I'm sure you must be deciding something or thinking about something. ये argument कई बार हमने देखा है, अलग-अलग international forums पे भी देखा है कि जो developing countries हैं, those who are part of the global south, they are told कि अब आप pollution कम कीजिए, आप इसके बारे में ज़रा सोचिए, ध्यान दीजिए. And this is being said by countries who have already had their fair share of pollution, have progressed, and they should be very happy about the progress they've made. But the argument is that it's a bit rich on their part to suggest to the developing world that you contain your growth, whereas, you know, we have had our share. How do you look at this?
No, if I were not in this distinguished gathering, I would give you some inner thoughts, but I'll spare you those now. You see, it's very easy that you can go around polluting the world and then you provide prescriptions to the others. माननीय प्रधानमंत्री जी की ने उनका दायित्व संभालने से पहले थोड़ा हमारी पॉलिसी में भी कंफ्यूजन था और मुझे याद है जब डॉक्टर साहब प्रधानमंत्री थे तो मैं आई वाज अ सीनियर सिविल सर्वेंट तो बहुत बार क्लाइमेट चेंज कॉन्टेक्स्ट में ये सवाल उठाया जाता था कि वेयर इज इंडिया व्हाट इज इंडियाज पोजीशन सो आई रिमेंबर one of us cheekily saying, sir, are we part of the problem or are we part of the solution? So obviously Dr. Saab was very measured in his words, wouldn't say it. So when one of us quipped there saying, if you want to be part of the problem, तो आपना एक negotiator का नाम दे उनको आगे कर दो. अगर if you want to be part of the solution, तो किस दूसरे को कर दो. But this kind of zigzagging went on till I think COP21. जब COP21 की meeting Paris में हुई थी, I think our Prime Minister took a decisive step and a very bold step. He said, ये mutual recrimination तो चलता रहेगा कि ये pollution कर रहे हैं, ये कर रहे हैं pollution, ये कर रहे हैं. अरे भाई, तो कोई आपसे पूछेगा, आप भी तो pollution कर रहे हैं. कहने नहीं, पर मेरी per capita emission जो है इनसे 1/10 है. Is that an argument for you to go on thing? So I think the PM took a very mature, bold step, saying we can go on talking about common but differentiated responsibility. We can go on reminding them that they are the polluters. But meanwhile, we've got to take action. And he took the action. He said, we will take action on our own because we have to save our own. I mean, the state of the country which you hand to your children or the next generation cannot be progressively getting worse from what you inherited. So he took that decision. And even on that 2070 जो कमिटमेंट थी नेट जीरो की मुझे याद है माननीय प्रधानमंत्री जी बिफोर ही टुक ऑफ फ्रॉम दिल्ली देयर वाज टॉक ही सेड नहीं इंडिया कांट डू दिस ये यूएस एनवॉय हैं क्या नाम है उनका जो पुराने जॉन कैरी उसके पहले एल गोर भी आए थे मुझे याद है तो बातचीत हो रही थी वो सब कह रहे थे इन इंडिया शुड डू समथिंग आई डोंट नो व्हाट द ब्यूरोक्रेसीज एडवाइस टू द प्राइम मिनिस्टर वाज but I think somewhere in the flight between wherever he was taking off from and Glasgow, PM made up his mind that he will. And he announced in net zero. उससे क्या effect हुआ? हमारी जो oil companies हैं, I don't think they are here today. उनसे पूछा जाए, कोई कहती है मेरी 2035 net zero commitment है, कोई कहता है 2040 है. You see, once the boss gives you the target, and once he says करना है, then it happens. And then we've got all kinds of other commitments, 2030 tak ye karna hai, itna percentage wo karna hai, etc. So this is now part of what I call an active part of our consciousness. And this is now going to bind us. So whether it is biofuels, compressed biogas, CNG, green hydrogen, how green is green? I'll tell you very frankly. I don't get that excited about electric vehicles because my point is if the grid is not green yet, I'm glad an electric vehicle emits less pollution than let's say a normal other vehicle.
Yeah, but how are you making electricity?
No, basically this is, I'm coming, so the whole grid is changing. So a lot of people will tell you, I mean I've had global experts come and tell me, you know, Minister, you should, we are very impressed with your green hydrogen. But don't make it exclusively green because there is a blue stage there where it is much better than now, if not totally green. So I think the Indian story is a sui generis one. It's unique because the kind of challenges you've got to feed. And as you keep reminding me, the people who are most vulnerable, we've got to get to them. We have to make sure they are moving, they have moved. By the way, as part of that, we also have an active discourage the use of kerosene policy. And discourage the use of kerosene means physically we are now bringing it, we are reducing it. I get a lot of flack from some of the states which want higher kerosene quotas for a variety of reasons. But it's moving. Even in Varanasi, we converted all the kerosene-powered boats into CNG boats during the, I think, India Energy Week or thereabouts, yeah.
Ambassador Puri, thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I must mention to the audience that today is Rajiv Chandrasekhar's wedding anniversary. It's perhaps an underlining of the importance of G20, not just this conclave, that he's willing to sacrifice that to be here to discuss. Rajiv, all through the morning, every speaker who's spoken has touched on DPI and India's prowess as far as DPI is concerned. You've had international acclaim and recognition from even the likes of Bill Gates. And you had a consensus at the G20 digital economy meet in Bengaluru. What's next in terms of creating these into concrete collaborations and turning this into India's soft power in a global environment?
So I think, thank you for, first of all, acknowledging that I have a difficult evening with my wife, explaining that I'm not in Bangalore, but let me move on to the topic of DPI. I think, look, one of the amazing things about the Indian presidency of the G20 has been how center stage the DPI conversation has become. And you know, if you look at pre the Indian presidency, the conversation about the DPI was still a very India-centric conversation. India was very proud, obviously, about the progress that we had made, and we had built the India stack. And there were many countries that were interested in engaging with India. But the India case study and the use of technology, the way India under Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji has over the last 9 years, to really transform governance, to really transform democracy and the lives of Indian citizens, and create a vibrant innovation ecosystem as well, has really caught the attention in the post-COVID world of all of these countries today, including the big, powerful G20 nations. So I'm actually very pleased and happy that this vision way back in 2015 that the Prime Minister had, that technology can really, truly empower and transform, and that India's case study of how it has done so is now beginning to catch the imagination of, and in a sense, many, many other nations want to jump onto this train of digitization and all of the collateral benefits that that digitization brings to their countries, to their people, to their economies.
And you've recently said that India's public delivery mechanism will be dominated by the DPI in the next couple of years. It will be the cornerstone of all government-to-citizen interface. Is that an ambitious target within the next 2 years? Do we have the systems in place for that?
No, absolutely. I think it is certainly a vision of our Prime Minister. It was a vision in 2015. We have demonstrated on that vision through a very, very exciting win-win relationship with the private sector and the government and the citizen at the center of that partnership. And the ambition now for the government of India that the Prime Minister has signaled is that we want to intensify the digitalization of the government and governance process. We want to expand the DPI framework to cover almost all public services, and therefore continue to widen and expand the innovation ecosystem that, in a sense, supports it and takes the DPI forward. One of the, I'll give you an example about how far and how strategically clear the vision of our government and our Prime Minister is. He said way back in 2021 that he wants artificial intelligence and learning to be built into DPI, and therefore AI for governance becomes a very important use case for artificial intelligence in India. So that is where we see the DPI progressing, that is where we see the India stack progressing. And even if you are a bitter cynic or the bitterest opponent of the government, you cannot but accept and acknowledge the fact that there are countries around the world that are lining up, in a sense, to say, look, can we also take this open source, very flexible, very innovative India stack, the India DPI, and customize it and implement it in our countries as well.
A lot of this will also depend on how private sector startups innovate in terms of customized solutions for other countries in the world. Is there any concrete example? I know there were about 11 countries after the G20 meeting in Bengaluru who have agreed on the DPI. Right. This one. Are there any concrete agreements that we've reached in terms of enforcing the India model, if I can call it that, in the rest of the world?
So I want to be clear, Veera, that we are not really enforcing any model. What we are doing today is essentially turning on its head the narrative about technology, that technology is very expensive, and that technology is very exclusionary, that only the very rich countries and the very rich people can afford the luxury of digitalization. This was the narrative for many years, that if a country wanted to digitize, if a country wanted to create solutions, they had to go running to these big, powerful technology companies that were invariably in the West. And that narrative has been turned on its head by the India DPI, because what the India DPI represents is really open source. Nobody owns it, but it is available for everybody. And that there is an ecosystem of India stack developers who are startups, small and medium technology companies, who are there to support the implementation of the India stack or the India DPI in any geography or any new application. So we have an extremely vibrant ecosystem. And for those who don't understand the journey of DPI, I always use this example about the vision and clarity of our Prime Minister. If you see what the UPI is, the UPI is a use case, is a solution to solve a pressing use case of the government. For many years, people looked at India and said 100 rupees leaves Delhi, 15 rupees reaches the beneficiary, because the whole process, the government pipe, is so leaky and corroded that there is so much of corruption and leakage. To solve that use case, the Prime Minister came up with JDY, then DBT, and and then you had UPI evolve. So just understand that you have governance problems being solved, and at the same time you have this vibrant innovation ecosystem, which has now become one of the world's biggest fintech innovation ecosystem. So it is the power of technology that has been discussed and debated on for years and decades. I think India has now become the preeminent country in the world to actually take technology and empower our people, and at the same time create this very, very vibrant and exciting ecosystem of startups and developers to support that innovation.
You've observed this not just as the minister, you've seen this telecom grow as an industrialist for many years. What, according to you, is that one aspect of India's story? And I'm asking this because there are several countries which don't know perhaps where to start in terms of establishing both a financial infrastructure as well as a governance infrastructure. While we seem to have made great progress, what do you think is that one aspect that you think has defined India's move forward in this area?
I think it is not, and I think the one big difference between how technology has been used and viewed in the post-2014 India versus the pre-2014 India is that in the pre-2014 India, the narrative about technology, and I'm not saying it's bad narrative or good narrative, was essentially about, oh, it's a great area, there's a lot of billionaires being created, lots of companies, lots of innovation, a lot of jobs, a lot of investment coming in, and it was part of the general economy, and this was a sector that was about 3 to 4% of the GDP. Post-2014, there is a conscious effort to embed technology into governance. And I always say this to audiences who don't know this. Pre-2014, India and our state governments have spent over 5-6 lakh crores in what has been euphemistically referred to as e-governance. So there have been multiple thousands and lakhs of crores spent by state governments on e-governance. But in 2014, there was still no platform or there was no framework. There were multiple independent solutions floating around with different pieces of people developing it. But there was no overall framework. There was no overall government of India architecture. There was no governance architecture. Post 2014, we had a political leader who understood the power of technology to improve governance. He made maximum governance his goal, which is our Prime Minister, and said, how will I use technology to deliver on that? Then the two became fused. And then you had solutions like UPI, you had an Aadhaar, which was a completely redesigned, rejuvenated Aadhaar, and you had the concept of a stack, which is Aadhaar, the UPI for payment, DigiLocker for storage, and all of these other layers that then came up. And frankly, if that vision and that clarity and that architecture had not been put into place before the COVID pandemic in 2020, we would be really floundering. We would be really we would have had a very difficult time during COVID. But the fact that we had built this architecture, built this framework, and it was already impacting governance and people's lives in a very real way is what helped us during the pandemic. And in a lot of ways today, the case study of India as seen by countries of the G20 and beyond is because of how technology helped us during this one really black swan event that all of the world experienced.
It sort of puts India at pole. But Rajiv, as we go forward, if I may use the term digital legal infrastructure or a digital legal framework is absolutely essential as we move forward. Now, your Digital Personal Data Protection Act is a starting step to it. Now, you have mentioned, and before I get into the finer aspects of the law, you've mentioned that it will create behavioral changes in data platforms and data companies. How are we going to ensure that the transformation is not disruptive both for companies as well as consumers?
So I'm actually going to continue with your last question and then go into this one, Veera. As we digitize and as we move from a country that was only about 35 crore Indians online, we are now about 85 crore Indians online, and by 2025 we'll be 120 crore Indians online, largest connected nation, increased and more intense digitization of our economy. Certainly there are two challenges that arise. One is cyber security, which is ensuring that our digital Nagriks, the 120 crore digital Nagriks, use the internet, see the internet as safe and trusted, and that there are measures of making sure that any crime or user harm on that is addressed through our cybersecurity framework. So that is one aspect. The second is, certainly it is not a secret, it's a very well-known fact, that as much as the internet represents good, there are also bad actors on the internet. And one of the aspects of bad actors is platforms essentially using personal data of digital Nagriks, small businesses and citizens, and misusing them, exploiting them, creating business models out of them, businesses out of them. Now, we believe that, and the Prime Minister has signaled very early on, after the 2017 judgment of the Supreme Court, that we need a global standard cyber law framework. And one element of that is the Digital Personal Data Protection Bill that you refer to. The twin objectives of that Digital Personal Data Protection Bill is, one, to put the brake on the misuse and exploitation. Brake as in B-R-A-K-E, not B-R-E-A-K. B-R-A-K-E, brake on that. The second is, much more medium to long term, is to create a significant symmetry in the relationship, addressing the asymmetry between citizen and the platform, and therefore a bigger, deeper behavioral change of accountability to those whose personal data is being used here. Now, it is certainly a different regime from where we are today. It is certainly not going to be easy or quick for people to transition, but the government of India has made it very clear that we do not want any abrupt, disruptive transition. We want the transition to be smooth. We want the transition to be orderly. At the same time, we don't want the transition to be such a long period that the citizens for whom the rights have been embedded in this bill are denied that, embedded in this act, are denied those rights. So we will see, we'll sit with the industry, we'll sit with consumer groups and figure out what is a reasonable, normal period to provide for an orderly transition to this new regime of more accountability and more symmetry.
It's still work in progress.
Of course, the act just got passed by Parliament, and we are in the process of talking to people. We have a number of things to do. The Data Protection Board needs to be built and notified. The rules need to be discussed and notified. And we certainly will give them a transition period to transition to, in a manner that is not disruptive and it's orderly.
So as we make that transition, one of the transition, the concern that's been raised, and it's a serious one, is over the fact that the DPDP, in a large sense, gives enormous power for the central government, both in terms of the influence it would have over a data protection board, as well as exemptions that it can offer. And these questions have been raised to you as well. Isn't that a genuine concern, and isn't that also important to rectify in case it has to gain credibility for that entire structure?
So let me just say this, and I don't mean to be rude or disrespectful for anybody who has a view like that, but it is, to gently respond, it is a wrong view. Because the powers that have been given to the government to use are really in very narrowly defined circumstances of emergencies. So if there's a national security incident, you don't certainly expect the government to go to the suspected terrorists and say, can you give me your consent for your personal data? If there is a health pandemic and the patient's blood group is important to be seen by the hospital or the government, you certainly don't want the government to go seek consent during a pandemic. If there is an earthquake or a natural disaster or a flood, and there's a patient who requires help or a family that requires assistance, it's certainly not the case that anybody can make that you have to go seek consent at that time. So the exceptions or exemptions, if you want to call it that, are for legitimate purposes and are for very, very narrowly defined purposes. Now, please understand that some of this argument is being put forth by people who believe privacy is an absolute right. In India, privacy is a fundamental right. And every fundamental right has reasonable restrictions. And those reasonable restrictions are that government to discharge its duty during a pandemic, government to discharge its duty during a natural disaster, government to discharge its duty during a national security event will need some exceptional powers. And those powers have been very well defined, very well carved out, and very well put. So that is on that question. On the DPB, this conversation again, I think, is because people, I would certainly request them to read it. The DPB is not a regulator. It is simply a body that adjudicates the consequences of a data breach. So if your data is with me, and I have consented to protect your data, but I breach it, sell it, accidentally, wittingly, unwittingly, the DPB is the body that steps in when you complain to it that says, Mr. X, you are therefore liable for so many crore rupees after a hearing, of course. That's all. Now, the DPB is a body that has to perform in a transparent manner and in a very open manner because the appeals of the DPB decision lie in the TD side where there's a judge who's a chairman. And the appeal from there lies in the Supreme Court. So I actually would like to reinforce this point that the performance of an institution like the DPB will be measured by its own conduct, its own actions. And I think we should give it time. We are building these institutions for a modern age, for the India decade. We certainly, for example, have not said that it should be only retired bureaucrats who should be manning the DPB. We want more and more youngsters to come out and volunteer to do 2 years, 3 years in these institutions. This is a very modern institution. We have designed it, conceived it, architected it to be a modern institution in this very, very modern space. Now, is there a reasonable chance that it will succeed? I believe yes. Is there an outside chance that there is a failure or some kind of a problem? Any institution has that chance of failure. At that point, we'll intervene and we'll strengthen the design.
Okay, let me ask you this way. I'm not persisting on this topic, but given the polarized atmosphere in the country and given the fact that there is an inherent fear of state control, is there something the government can do or communicate to ensure that the feeling or the perception of independence of the DPB is established? Given our history with institutions, it's important.
Look, I mean, I'm open to suggestions about what we can say. We can only say, look, it is independent. It will be independent. Its actions will speak for louder than any words that I can put forth. And finally, look, any legislation, anything that we do for the tech space has to continue to evolve. By definition, anything we do in the tech space is always going to be work in progress. To believe that we have an ultimate, well-designed, perfect for the next 10 years type of legislation is fooling yourself. So fair enough, if down the road we find there has to be something that is done to improve its performance, broad base, who comes in mans the DPB, we will consider it. But I think at this stage to jump around phraseology like accountability, independent, autonomous, I think is not to understand the fact that we have designed this to be accountable. Something that is independent is not necessarily the best. Something in the government is also not necessarily the worst. Now, ISRO just put Chandrayaan-3 on the moon. Nobody says that ISRO should be independent and ISRO should be not government. So I think this belief that somehow we are being told to believe again and again that being in the government somehow means it is not good and outside the government is good. I certainly can tell you I've been 18 years in politics. I've been many years as an entrepreneur. I don't buy that. There are great people in government, there are super people in government, there are bad people in government, and that applies to the private sector as well. So we should only look at these things through the prism of accountability and performance, and if there is a failure, the government of the day will certainly step in and fix the failure.
Right, unfortunately, not all of us have the perception from inside the government. Most of us have it from outside. But Rajiv, just another point, not necessarily related to this, and this is in the context of law and order before I move into AI and more substantive issues as far as digital economy is concerned. In the context of law and order, one of the things that has been resorted to for law and order agencies is an internet shutdown. We've seen that in Manipur, we've seen that in Jammu Kashmir, we've seen that in Nu, for instance, when there is violence. But there is, on the other hand, we are looking at building a DPI where your entire government service is dependent on the internet. There is absolutely no question of internet being a fundamental right. Is there a thinking that's on to find a way out and make sure that internet shutdowns are not essentially the way to a trigger for a law and order situation immediately?
So the internet shutdown or a lawful shutdown of the internet is not something that is unique to India. The UK does it, the US has done it, India has done it, many countries do it. When they are faced with a situation where misinformation and false information becomes so viral, because that is the inherent attribute of the internet, that fake news and misinformation travels at a velocity of 10, 20, 30 times faster than the truth. And this is something that there are studies done. We have done the studies ourselves. And the audience that a misinformation reaches is a huge audience. Again, 10 to 100 times more than the audience that the truth and the facts get to. So there is like I said, the internet for many years and technology in general for many years was always seen as a power for good. And I won't tell you how old I am, but certainly I'm old enough to tell you that I worked at the early days of the internet. And so it was a utopia. Internet would connect all the good people in the world and all good ideas would be exchanged and we would just build a better future, better world. That was the construct. But we also know there are state actors, there is deliberate misinformation, there is weaponization of misinformation. We have seen this recently in the Khalistani bot example, which the Washington Post exposed. We have seen the DG ISPR in Pakistan using misinformation. So therefore, misinformation is unfortunately today one of the biggest harms and challenges for all democratic societies. Not just India, it is true for the US, it's true for UK, it's true everywhere. And weaponization of misinformation is basically the reason why internet shutdown, which is almost a last resort, is being having to be resorted to. Because how do you deal with misinformation today? No country is able to figure out. That is why the Singapore government has come up with these very tight restrictions on misinformation, which is why the Australians are doing it, which is why the Canadians are doing it. So I think it is time in India as well that we have a discussion around misinformation. We are certainly in the Digital India Act, the next step of the legislative framework for the digital space, going to have a whole section on misinformation. And I think that's a good time to have this conversation. If we figure out a way to make the internet safe and trusted, then there is lesser and less need for internet takedowns. But at the moment, the internet has as much of good stuff, truth, as it has misinformation. And we have to figure out a way or how to deal with it.
I don't want to persist on that point. Obviously, as you say, there are concerns over disinformation as well, from all actors in that field. And you also said you won't tell us your age. I'm sure you're not old enough to forget your wedding anniversary, which you're flying back to this evening. I just want to touch on the concept of artificial intelligence, and the Prime Minister has said that you need a global regulatory framework on it. It's perhaps the biggest challenge that we face today as we move forward. What's the thinking on that? Is there some shape for such a regulatory framework that's come? And from an India point of view, what would be the biggest concern?
So AI, for example, again, like I said, like the internet and like most of technology, we believe AI is a force for good. We have publicly said as a government that AI is a kinetic enabler of our digital economy, and we have a goal of $1 trillion digital economy, and AI will be a significant part of that. The Prime Minister, way back in 2021, talked about India for AI and AI for India. So we are very heavily invested in artificial intelligence in terms of our digital economy. Now, having said that, like I said, if you marry misinformation and the threat of misinformation and the power of AI to take misinformation to another level altogether, which I have personal experience of even during the Karnataka election, the deep fakes that are now coming out of the AI world are just way, way too good.
You had Mammootty and Mohanlal play Godfather.
Yeah, exactly. And that was still, in my opinion, a bit crude and rough around the edges. But there are sophisticated models today churning out deep fakes that are absolutely indistinguishable from the real stuff. So we have to figure out a framework where, like the rest of the internet, AI does not cause harm. And our initial approach to this, which you will see in the Digital India Act, is that we will regulate, if you want to call it the word regulation, but at least create the guardrails for all of emerging technology through the prism of user harm. So in simple English, what this means is, we will say, look, you can innovate anything you want in AI, accepting your innovation cannot cause harm, cannot cause criminality. And as long as you agree to that basic principle, you can create the next fanciest, spiffiest innovation. Yeah. So this is tentatively our approach. We don't want to be prescriptive. We don't want to say this you should not do, that you should not do, which is certainly the way the Europeans are going. We have approached this. We will see during consultation what is the general feedback of the industry and the consumers to it, and then we'll move forward.
You're making a very nuanced point. India's approach is not the way the Europeans are approaching the issue.
Yeah, so our approach in the privacy side has been very different from the European GDPR. The European way of regulating the space is a lot more prescriptive. They go way into details and they say, you shall not do this, you shall not do that. I mean, it's a slightly different approach. Ours is more principle-led. Ours is more citizen rights and citizen and platform obligation-led. So if you look at the GDPR and read the DPDP, you will see that this is a much different, if I may say so, more elegant, more principle-based, less prescriptive. Of course, that I'm saying it, so I'll say good things about the DPDP, of course. But the GDPR is not, I'm not saying it's bad or it's wrong, but they take a slightly different approach of being more prescriptive. I think they are signaling to the world that they want to be prescriptive in AI. And what we are, at least at this stage, saying is that we want to be regulating all emerging technologies through the prism of our safety and trust goals of the internet and user harm.
Yeah, you know, we may be walking into a world where you may be a deep fake, I may be a deep fake sitting and having a conversation here, and the real one could be somewhere else. So, you know, moving forward from AI and digital data protection, coming to some policy decisions that the center had taken in terms of the ban on laptops from outside, and you know, it's been deferred. What's the intention behind the move? There seems to be still lack of clarity in terms of communication and a lot of concerns raised by manufacturing giants.
So there is no ban. So first of all, I just want to be very clear up front. There is no ban, there is no licensing, there is no license Raj. Unfortunately, I think the communication of what we did wasn't the best and the most perfect. So I think all of the spin then walked into the vacuum and then started positioning this as licensing Raj and license Raj and etc. It is none of the above. I'll explain to you what our thinking is. The Indian digital ecosystem is at an inflection point. We think the next 3 to 5 years, the demand for digital devices, whether they are smartphones or laptops or servers for data centers that power the cloud, is going to exponentially go up. Now, as a responsible government, we want to make sure that everything that goes into the Indian internet, ranging from an IoT sensor to a server that is powering a cloud, to a laptop, to a tablet, to a smartphone, are all trusted devices. And therefore, we don't want equipment coming into the country which is anything other than being trusted. Now, therefore, there is a, and in this particular context, I want to clarify that most of the servers and most of the laptops are manufactured in one geography, and I won't say the country's name, but you certainly get what I mean. And therefore, we don't want that dependence, we don't want that strategic concentration of all of these digital devices that are coming into our country and building a digital ecosystem and network to come from anything other than trusted sources. So what we are telling the industry is that this is not a licensing, Raj, this is an import management system whose only goal is that we want in India, bought into India, imported into India, made in India, only stuff that is trusted by us. Okay. And as an extension of that conversation, we are saying, look, why don't you manufacture in India, because then you're certainly trusted. Or if you are wanting to import it, we'll certainly figure out where you can import it, but you should import it from a trusted source. That is the net sum and substance of what we are attempting to do. Unfortunately, I think the way it came out, it wasn't communicated correctly, and that happens. Otherwise, we do not do anything, and this government will certainly not do anything that is even remotely disruptive of the growth of our digital economy. That is an absolute promise, and that is not just my promise, it is a commitment from our Prime Minister. But at the same time, we have an absolute obligation and an important obligation to make sure what comes into our Indian internet, what comes into the digital ecosystem of India is trusted equipment, trusted devices, trusted sourced equipment. And by the way, this conversation goes into 5G baseband radio. It goes into NB-IoT types of radio modules. So this conversation is not just limited to these 3-4 categories. It's a broader conversation. And we don't want to be in the position of many Western countries today who are already up the curve and then find that 80% of all their equipment is from sources that are very dubious. Right. So, well, we are planning for the future. We are planning this as a very important part of our future.
So it's not an economic decision, it's a security concern.
It's a future of our internet, future of our digital ecosystem consideration around trusted equipment and trusted products.
And last couple of questions to you, and I want to speak about something you've been passionately involved about, which is the semicon space, the semiconductor space. Now, this is a globally extremely competitive space with countries like the US offering, you've obviously got Micron to sign up in Gujarat. Is that space too difficult for India to compete in? Are we wasting too many resources?
No, look, first of all, I will certainly tell you, not because I'm a junior minister in the Modi government or the Modi team, I will certainly tell you that there is nothing today in the tech space that is difficult for India. First of all, that has to be very clearly understood. This is a country that is today building INS Vikrant with the electronic and sensor capability that can match or outmatch anything that is sailing anywhere on the seas. This is a country that has taken a complex project like Chandrayaan-3 and executed it, conceived it, built it, executed it over 4 years. This country today is building chips, designing chips that are powering our Vikram lander. The chips were designed in India by the Space Application Center and manufactured in the Semiconductor Complex Limited in Mohali. So I think for a minute to believe that there is something that is not doable for India is not to understand where we have reached in the last 9 years. But semiconductor fabs are a holy grail in a sense of it's an intersection of science and engineering, science and technology at the ultimate level. It is very, very, very complex science, it is very complex engineering, and it is the ultimate in manufacturing and science and engineering and everything combined. And we are having to do all of this after 65 years or 70 years of doing nothing about it. So I think we should understand this is a medium to long-term game. We didn't do anything for the 65 years. We are trying to do in the next 10 years what China tried to do in 30 years, spent $200 billion and failed. And we are trying to do this in the next 10 years. So we will get there. I have absolute confidence that with this type of clarity, strategic clarity of our Prime Minister, we will certainly get to fabs. But before that, we will be doing a number of equally exciting things in packaging innovation. We will be doing a number of exciting things in designing next generation chips out of Indian startups and Indian companies working in partnership or without partnership with foreign companies. So we will certainly be in the next few years making a significant mark on the semiconductor supply chains and value chains that we were absent from 65, 70 years.
You're a confident man with all these this ones. I hope you'll be confident when you meet your wife this evening. What are you planning to get for her?
First of all, I have to break the bad news that I'm not going to meet her this evening. So that is, so that's the thing. But I will certainly catch up with her on 29th for Onam.
Okay.
And I'll be with family for Onam. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rajiv, for taking time out and speaking with us here.
Moonshot. We are honored to have with us the Minister of State for Science and Technology, Dr. Jitendra Singh, who's among us. I request you all to welcome Dr. Singh among us. And while the G20 is definitely highlighting India on the global map, the other major achievement that has put India ahead of many even advanced economies is the historic Chandrayaan-3 launch. ISRO made history through the Chandrayaan by making India the first ever country to land a spacecraft successfully on the south pole of the moon. And we have the man to talk about India's achievements and what India's space programs could have in the future. Dr. Jitendra Singh joining us. It's over to my colleague Vishnu Shom for a conversation with Dr. Singh.
Well, I can tell you, and thank you all very much for sort of being so intently wrapped up by everything that is happening over here. There are few themes in my 27 years of journalism which have excited me more than Chandrayaan. It's not just Chandrayaan-3, but the entire Indian Space Research Organization program. But what India has achieved through Chandrayaan-3 is actually a jump. It's a jump from a technology standpoint. It's a jump in terms of our own ambitions. It gives us a look at where we are headed. But it is the hard work of women and men, engineers, scientists, researchers, guided by a certain vision, which has actually come of age. And it's actually a stepping stone for what the future of space and India is all about. The Minister Jitendra Singh is the best person in this country, perhaps, to speak about India's space ambitions. Thank you so much for being with us. Off the top, I must ask you, and don't deny it because I think I know the answer to the question. I was very nervous just before Vikram went down and touched the surface. How nervous were you?
No, certainly. So I think those of us who have been more closely associated, both the ISRO team and I being associated with them, had certain more nervous, number of nervous moments, certain more vulnerable moments because we were following a timeline. So we knew, like a pilot who knows that he's to take a turn or he's to compromise clouds. So we knew that somewhere, I think my first nervous moment was when the Chandrayaan had to leave the Earth's orbit and then, get into the moon's orbit, because that's like changing track of a motor car you're driving. So suddenly you're asked to move from this track to the other track and without causing any mishap on the way. So that happened in the middle of one night. And now, of course, in the last few minutes, particularly when we are very conscious that when it reaches about 300 kilometers, the speed suddenly goes down from 6,000 kilometers per hour downwards because two of the engines also shut off. And since most of the viewers are simply enjoying the fantasy of it, they are not aware of it, luckily so, good for them. But those of us, they know, because after about 150 meters or so, we lose all contact. So then it's left to the wisdom and discretion of Vikram. It's just like how well you have trained the child or the boy to be there. Because then it is up to him to decide, because he has the sensors, he has the camera. So just as the pilot announces crew, prepare landing, something like that. Here it is go, no go.
Right.
And the pilot can take rounds in the sky as you sometimes experience. Here it doesn't happen because you have the NL algorithm and which lies in a radius of about 4 kilometers or so, and if in the given span of time, it's not able to actually make up its mind, and the time is over, then we don't risk it, and it is deferred to the next day. Yeah. So these are very, crucial moments because you don't know what is happening there and what assessment, evaluation, or inferences are going to be drawn by the Vikram. So that's also a test of how well has he been trained for that task. It's just like sending a soldier on the front, and then you don't know. Then it is left to him to face the challenge on the spot at the spur of moment. But luckily here, it was so smooth that it didn't have even to compromise. It just went down. In fact, touched the surface of moon a few minutes or seconds earlier than expected.
Yeah. The Prime Minister has an affinity to science. We've been talking about this over the last couple of days, particularly space and ISRO. It's something that interests him a great deal. He's spoken about it in the past as well. He's followed it even when he was Chief Minister.
Absolutely.
So he was in BRICS, and he was doing all of that, but simultaneously his mind was obviously in Bengaluru.
Absolutely. And to pick up from what you were saying in your introductory remarks, Vishnu, it's been a quantum jump. Yeah. And many of us may not realize the quantum jump has happened because of Prime Minister Modi having thrown open the space sector, which is sometimes described as unlocking of the space sector, has been popularly described in the media. So, till about 4 years back, the gates of Sriharikota were forbidden. This time when this launching happened on the 14th of July, we had as many as more than 1,000 media persons inside. Yeah. We had school and college boys and girls. We had people from public life. We had even ministers, right, from Punjab up to Kerala. So there was a huge amount of enthusiasm, as a result of which I think this mission has been owned up. The kind of enthusiasm you were referring to is because everybody owns up this mission. Earlier on, we were functioning behind a veil of secrecy. So nobody knew what was happening. Even if there was a launching, it would appear in the form of a small news in a remote corner of a newspaper. People would not be able to figure out where actually is the Sriharikota on this planet. So this is because Prime Minister Modi has broken these taboos of past, and I know sometimes I wonder why it couldn't have happened earlier. At the same time, even at the physical level, it has increased funding. It has enthused the private sector. It has enthused the industry. Within just 3-4 years, we have more than 150 startups, private startups, which the Prime Minister was referring in his address this morning as well. We had just 3 or 4 of them because they didn't find anything attractive over there. And now some of these startups, like Skyroot and others who have come in the recent months, are now also turning into entrepreneurs, making fortune out of it. So it's become a new avenue of livelihood as well, in addition to generating space economy. So actually it is indeed a quantum jump, which has happened in the last 4-5 years, both in terms of resources, also in the terms of the belonging of the mission, which has become pan-India.
Let me ask you some direct questions. This is done. There may be more Chandrayaan missions in the future, but Gaganyaan is the next big ambition for India. There will be astronauts. Will we have eventually, or perhaps even in the start, a woman astronaut?
See, to begin with, just to give you the sequence of events, Gaganyaan unfortunately got delayed. Yeah. We had a very ambitious plan to see it happening somewhere around the 75th year of India's independence, 22-23. But then suddenly COVID came in, and in fact, when the lockdown happened, some of our potential astronauts were undergoing a stint of training at the Gregory Institute in Moscow. They had to be called back. So the whole thing got delayed. So now we are planning the first trial mission, which will possibly happen around first or second week of October. We thought we could do it in September, but now September we'll have Aditya, and then October first week. So which will sort of mimic the eternal. It'll go up for a few hours, come back. Because sending up a human being is as important as getting him or her safe back. So that's equally important. Otherwise, it'll be a huge setback by all means. So how to get the human being back, which are the spots identified? We've already identified 2 or 3 locations in the water. Then it'll be a collective effort. The Navy functionaries would be there, the Coastal Guard. So that will mimic that eternally. In the second trial, we'll have not a soulful human being, but a human being in the form of a robo, and that will be a female robo.
Right. So that answers my question.
Also,
in the future,
and she's been named as Vayomitra.
Okay.
So Vayo Mitra will be the female, not a human female, but a robo female who would be accompanying. That might happen in the beginning of next year. So she will mimic all the activities. She'll perform all those activities which will be expected to be performed by the astronauts when they actually go up in the first ever indigenous human flight, because one human being had already flown in the form of Rakesh Sharma, but that was Soviet. So she will do all the activity, perform all the functions, then come back and mimic landing, and then getting her back, receiving her back safely would also happen in the manner in which it is expected to happen. And once everything goes off to our satisfaction, then of course it will be the human being. It could be 2, it could be 3, it could be male, it could be female. That's yet to be taken a call.
Next question, will there be an Indian space station?
I think we just move from one level to other. So we cannot be denying that, but we may not be able to fix a time schedule for that, because sometimes our missions get delayed on account of imponderables like happened in the form of pandemic, sometimes because of the planetary positions, because the dates are fixed in the heavens.
Yes.
Like Prime Minister today said that he was missing all the time. But it couldn't be held because the date had been fixed, and so also the BRICS date.
Yeah.
Otherwise, he would have liked to be there himself physically. So all these dates also sometimes keep changing. Now, for example, if God forbid it had not happened on the 23rd as we had scheduled, then next possible date would have been 27th.
Yeah.
So the positioning of the plan is the day and night cycle, all those things. So we have Gaganyaan, we have Aditya, we have possibly follow-up of the Mangalyaan, and then finally space station. But what is heartening is now that you would have realized during Prime Minister Modi's DC visit, Washington DC visit, all the agreements were technology heavy.
Yeah.
And one of them was Americans soliciting Indian astronauts to accompany them to the International Space Station, which has about 20-25 countries, being a part of it. So now those who started the journey much, much earlier than us, particularly the USA and the then Soviet Union, are now actually looking up to us not as equal partners, but also looking up to us for vital cues, particularly after the Chandrayaan success, the Chandrayaan-1 getting the evidence of water molecules. And there's much of expectation from Chandrayaan-3,
Yeah.
because the inputs obtained will be virgin even for the other nations,
Sure.
because they wouldn't have had this experience.
I'll talk about that in just a moment, but when do we expect an Indian astronaut on board the International Space Station? Do we have a rough idea when?
I think it will be in near future, because that's what has been...
Next couple of months, or
it could
within
be
the next
so.
year?
It could be so. The dates have not been fixed, but the US offer is of a nature, very
Sure.
inviting nature. They wish us to be there.
You said something interesting. You said that the robot would be called Vyomitra. So does that mean that our astronauts will be called Vyomnauts?
Let's wait and see. But we have a huge women participation in our space missions. I must confess that. And they're all first generation women. It's not by there you can't have the dynasty.
No.
Because it's purely merit. And hats off to them. Most of our missions, including the Gagan mission, has a huge women scientist presence.
There's another wonderful aspect of ISRO, where ISRO's leaders are deeply spiritual people, and they're scientists of the highest order. And it is seamless. For them, science and spirituality, and that sort of, the spirituality gives them motivation at one level, and the science is what guides them in their minds. And that's a culture, I think, of ISRO.
No, absolutely. Again, I think I can't help giving credit to Prime Minister Modi. Till a few years ago, Sriharikota was banned for outsiders, by and large. So I always used to wonder why it's so. So when it was put across Prime Minister, he was so supportive. And now we are also conducting tours of students, college and school, boys, girls, to actually have a feel of what it's all about. Because you would realize, as I agree with you, Vishnu, the entire work culture is slightly different. I think it's a kind of role model for the rest to follow. That they never superannuate.
Right.
So they give all their life to the mission. So you would see, even in any of the missions, you see all these retired scientists also there, all the retired chairmen also there. They get involved in the mission right from the beginning. They continue to contribute. They might have superannuated officially, but they continue to remain a part of the team in formal or informal capacity. So that is a very healthy culture. They have dedicated their life to the mission. their caliber is of the highest order. I've always been saying that we have cost-effective missions because we make up for the cost through our human cerebral, resources. We had someone like Sarabhai who could carry the launcher on the carriage of his bicycle, and still hope of reaching where Soviet Union and USA were already hoping to reach. So that way, and secondly, after every launch, they pay an obeisance at Tirupati, as you rightly said. And immediately after the launch, you know how the celebration is by distributing a laddu, the Tirupati laddu to each one of them. So I think it's the ideal blend of India's traditional heritage and the most updated modern Indian technology, for which our scientists are known. In fact, our space scientists have been acknowledged as among the best in the world, and that is evident from the fact that our graduates and postgraduates from our Trivandrum Institute are actually spread all over the world. Even the NASA is being manned by them.
In fact, that was my next question. A lot of the engineers at ISRO are from regional engineering colleges. They are not necessarily from the most advanced colleges in the world. And so it is a celebration of what an Indian education and engineering and science can actually achieve.
Absolutely. As I said, because I have been a part of the fraternity all my life, the scientific, I think I personally feel our Trivandrum Institute is among the best in the world. And I think the best evidence of that is that they have 100% placement, and most of them are absorbed in premier institutes of the world like NASA. So with the space having got unlocked in the last 4-5 years and new avenues having opened up, I think that will be the other implication of it, that brain drain happening would also stop, because we have a lot of avenues now, both in space economy, in space entrepreneurship, in space startups.
Frugal engineering has been at the heart of what ISRO does. But what if I was to ask you this, that frugal engineering has gotten us where we have, but in the future, if we are to have a space station, if we are to have a deep space mission, we need to be able to fund ISRO. And that means potentially billions of dollars or equivalent. Are we willing to spend?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try to explain that in 2 or 3 parts. A, that after this quantum jump, as you rightly mentioned, in the last 3-4 years, there has been increase in the pace of the economy generation. Even we are rendering our facility to the foreign satellites. We have launched more than 380 foreign satellites so far. We have earned more than about 250 million euros. And from America, we have earned more than $170 million or so. So that's one part of it, by lending out our launching site. Overall, the India's space economy today stands about 8 billion, which is just about 2% of the global percentage. But the entire world is recognizing the increased pace, and that's why the conservative projections are that 80 billion by 2040. But the other day, I think about 2-3 days back, we had that ALD report, other little report, which mentions that we could have the potential of 100 billion by 2040, which is going to be a huge, gigantic jump. And that's what the world is now expecting, because we have started moving very fast. Our launchings are also very frequent. And in addition to that, the funding is also happening because it's been opened up to the private participation. And third, the most recent decision, which is again a very historic decision, it didn't get so much of publicity because the other news came in, was the National Research Foundation, the Anusandhan, which is going to follow the same parameters as is followed in the rest of the world, because let's not forget that if we have to play a global role, our parameters have to be global, our challenges have to be global, our strategies have to be global. So we had a National Research Society in America, we had one in Germany, we had some country. I know why, again, we had to wait for Prime Minister Modi. So many things have happened after Prime Minister Modi came in, and particularly in the area of science and technology. So we have this National Research Foundation called Anusandhan, which was passed in the last session of Parliament. It will be heavily tilted towards non-government sources, in the sense that, for example, if we have a 50,000 crore budget for 5 years, as much as about 36,000 will be contributed from non-government sources. It could be from philanthropy, it could be from private sector, it could be from CSR, it could be from domestically, it could be from foreign investment, as is happening in the other countries. Sure. Because that's how the NASA has grown. because they was not purely dependent on the government sources. Even today, much of the funding happens from the other source. So I think that's going to be a huge, huge turnover.
So you're going to scale up your
absolutely, and
funding
I
of ISRO.
think once we get going, the National Research Foundation that we have envisaged in the form of Anusandhan is going to be a more outcome-oriented and a better version of the National Research Society of America.
Sure. Let's talk a little bit about America in the sense that when the Prime Minister was there, he signed the landmark Artemis Accords. Now, I think this is also something that's worth discussing, the fact that India is interested in space in terms of peaceful collaboration, non-militarization of space, and peaceful exploration, collaboration and exploration. And so therefore, you've defined the vision of ISRO going forward. We are not in competition with China. We are in competition with ourselves for our technology, and we want to work with other nations.
No, absolutely. I think this is very much in keeping with the ethos that India has been following. In fact, our space program and our nuclear energy program began almost around the same time. And right from the beginning, the founding fathers, the two programs had made it very clear that this is going to be the peaceful purposes. Though sometimes I wonder when Homi Bhabha said this in the context of atomic energy, how much he would have been trusted, because Hiroshima and Nagasaki had happened just about 7-8 years earlier, when the first atomic energy program was launched by Homi Bhabha. But he had the confidence to say that this is going to be for peaceful purposes, regardless of whether the world trusted him. But now we have actually vindicated ourselves. Both, even in our nuclear energy, is being used for other purposes, for medical treatments, for managing the shelf lives, etc., of vegetable, fruit, etc. And similarly, our space technology is also being used for, I think that is one distinguished feature of, in the context of India, unlike many other countries. We are not only confining ourselves to the launching of rockets, though that sounds very fantastic and the imagery is very romantic and it conjures up our imagination and enthuses the entire nation and the common citizen. But more than that, in fact, and that also happened after I think it was in 2016, it was at the behest of Prime Minister Modi, a marathon workshop was arranged, where all the space scientists were made to sit with the representatives of different sectors. The result of which is, today we have space technology virtually in every Indian household and virtually in every Indian infrastructure. That is also again for the peaceful development purposes. Whether it's roads and buildings, whether it's smart cities, whether it's laying down of the railway tracks, whether it's manning the unmanned railway tracks, it's telemedicine, it is digital. Our Swamitva program, that program for the mapping of the farms and lands, again purely dependent on space technology. So we have a new geospatial policy coupled with the drones. So the entire scenario has been given a different kind of outlook and to bring ease of living in the life of a common man. So absolutely, not only we are professing that, we are also living up to that, because space technology has become a means of peaceful, fast-track development in this country.
Navigation is something which
absolutely, disaster management. I remember what Prime Minister said in the morning, very beautifully he put it. Yeah. Some people question the cost. The cost saved by avoiding the disasters is much more than the cost spent. It was 600 crore. And now we are also actually coming to the aid of the other countries. Yes. I think it was in 2015 or early 2016, we set up a satellite. Which is popularly called SARC satellite because it covers all the other countries, except Pakistan did not want to be a part of it. That is to their disadvantage. But all the other neighboring countries, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, they all are a part of that. So we are actually providing, our satellite, providing them inputs about possible disaster events happening. So actually we are also now coming to the aid of the others. So absolutely these are all peaceful activities, peaceful purpose activities.
Yeah. Well, there you have it. And I think Minister Jitendra Singh, the best person to speak about the entire Indian space program. It's something that he personally deals with on a day-to-day basis. But what an inspiration ISRO is to all of us. And it's just so wonderful to talk about ISRO and celebrate India's moment in the moon. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Vishnu. I enjoyed it.